What if a missing book of the Bible contained secrets about giants and our true past? The Book of Giants is an ancient text discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, yet it was never included in the Bible. Some believe it reveals hidden stories about powerful beings, mysterious events, and a version of history most people have never heard. Connected to the story of the Nephilim, this banned text raises a disturbing question. Why was it removed, and what does it reveal that wasn't meant to be known? Is it simply mythology, or a lost piece of human history? In this video, we uncover the mystery behind the Book of Giants and the secrets it may hold about our past. There is a document that was buried for 2,000 years, not lost through accident, not forgotten through neglect, but hidden, concealed in the dry caves of the Judean desert where the Dead Sea meets the barren cliffs of Qumran. And when it was finally recovered in the 20th century, the world was told almost nothing about it. Scholars studied it quietly. Theologians argued about it behind closed doors. A handful of academic papers were published in journals most people will never read. And then it was filed away, cataloged, assigned a reference number, and the mainstream conversation moved on as if nothing unusual had been found. But what was found was extraordinary. What was found was a text so disruptive to the official narrative of human origins, so incompatible with the sanitized version of biblical history that had been handed down through centuries of institutional religion, that it could not be allowed to enter the public discourse in any meaningful way. What was found was the Book of Giants. To understand why this document matters so profoundly, why it changes everything we think we know about the ancient world, about the origins of civilization, about the nature of the beings described in the oldest religious texts on Earth, we have to begin at the beginning. Not the beginning of the 20th century, not the beginning of the Common Era, but the beginning as it was understood by the people who wrote these texts, who preserved them at enormous personal risk, who sealed them in clay jars and hid them in caves, knowing that what they were protecting was more dangerous than any weapon, more subversive than any political manifesto. They were protecting a memory of a world that existed before our world, a memory of beings that walked this earth before human civilization as we understand it was established, a memory of what those beings did, what they knew, what they built, and why they had to be destroyed. The Book of Giants does not exist in your Bible. It is not in the Old Testament. It is not in the New Testament. It was not included in the Apocrypha, that collection of texts which even the most liberal Christian denominations acknowledge as belonging to the broader scriptural tradition. It was not declared canonical by any council, any synod, any ecclesiastical assembly in the long and complicated history of the Christian or Jewish church. And yet it was found in the same caves, preserved in the same careful manner, written in the same ancient Hebrew and Aramaic scripts, by the same community of scholars and scribes who produced the documents we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls. The same Dead Sea Scrolls that scholars and theologians universally acknowledge as among the most important archaeological discoveries in human history. The Book of Giants was found alongside the texts we consider sacred. It was treated with the same reverence, the same care, the same deliberate preservation. Someone thought it was worth dying to protect. The question we need to ask, the question that every serious researcher who has spent time with these ancient documents eventually arrives at, is why? Why was this text excluded? Why was the decision made, at some point in the history of the early church and the rabbinic Jewish tradition, to leave the Book of Giants outside the walls of the canon? The standard answer, the one that gets offered in academic settings when the question is raised at all, is that the canonical process was complicated, that many texts were considered and rejected, that the Book of Giants simply did not meet the theological or historical criteria established by those who made these decisions. But this answer, when examined carefully, is deeply unsatisfying. Because when you read what the Book of Giants actually says, when you sit with the text, fragment by fragment, and reconstruct its narrative from the pieces that survived 2 millennia of time and hostility, you begin to understand that the problem was not that the text failed to meet the criteria. The problem was that the text met those criteria far too well. It was excluded not because it was theologically irrelevant, but because it was theologically explosive. The Book of Giants tells the story of the Nephilim, For most people, that word registers as something vaguely biblical, something that appears in a strange and cryptic passage in the book of Genesis before the narrative of Noah and the flood. Genesis 6:4 reads, in most modern translations, something like this: the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. 2 verses. That is all the canonical Bible gives you. 2 verses describing beings of enormous significance. Beings whose existence apparently prompted a global catastrophe, whose memory survived in the traditions of virtually every ancient culture on Earth. And then the text moves on to Noah and the ark and the flood, as if the Nephilim were simply a detail, a footnote, a passing curiosity in the longer narrative of divine judgment. The Book of Giants is what the Bible does not tell you. It is the full account, names, actions, dreams, warnings, judgments, of who the Nephilim were, what they did on this earth, and what ultimately happened to them. And the reason it was excluded from the canon is that this full account is so much more specific, so much more detailed, so much more disturbing than what the sanitized Genesis narrative allows for, that including it would have made the official story of human origins impossible to maintain. We are going to go through this text carefully. We are going to examine every fragment, every recovered passage, every scholarly analysis of the Book of Giants that has been produced since its discovery. We are going to place it in its proper historical context, alongside the Book of Enoch, from which much of its tradition derives, alongside the Mesopotamian epic literature that shares its themes and sometimes its characters, alongside the traditions of ancient Egypt, ancient Sumer, ancient Babylon, ancient Greece, and dozens of other civilizations that independently preserved memories of the same beings, the same events, the same catastrophe. We are going to look at what archaeology has found, the physical evidence, the skeletal remains, the megalithic structures, the ancient sites that defy easy explanation, and we are going to ask the question that the establishment has consistently refused to ask publicly. What if these texts are not mythology? What if they are history? Because here is what becomes clear when you study this material with genuine rigor and genuine open-mindedness. The world described in the Book of Giants is not the world of fantasy literature. It is not the world of fairy tales or folk mythology in the dismissive sense that those terms imply. It is a world with specific geographical locations, specific historical figures, specific technological and cultural details that align again and again and again with what independent archaeological discovery has revealed about the ancient past. It is a world that was real. The beings it describes were real, and the implications of that reality for everything we have been told about human history, human origins, and the nature of the universe we inhabit are so profound that they cannot be overstated. This is not a fringe theory. This is not the territory of conspiracy thinking or pseudo-scientific speculation. Every scholar who has spent serious time with the Dead Sea Scrolls acknowledges the existence and importance of the Book of Giants. The fragments have been published in peer-reviewed academic editions. The text has been analyzed by some of the most rigorous philologists and ancient language specialists in the world. What has been suppressed is not the existence of the document. That much is now public knowledge, available to anyone willing to seek it out. But the conversation about what the document means, the conversation about its implications, the conversation about why it was excluded and what that exclusion tells us about the forces that have shaped our understanding of human history, that conversation is the one that has been systematically avoided, systematically discouraged, systematically ridiculed whenever anyone has tried to have it in public. That conversation is the one we are going to have right now. The stakes are high. They are higher than most people realize. Because what the Book of Giants ultimately reveals is not simply that the ancient world was more complex than we have been told. It reveals that the management of human knowledge, the decision about what gets remembered and what gets forgotten, what gets called sacred scripture and what gets called heresy or myth, has been in the hands of institutions with specific interests from the very beginning. It reveals that the official story of where we come from and what we are has been curated, edited, and in some cases deliberately falsified. And it reveals, most disturbingly of all, that the beings whose memory the Book of Giants preserves, the giants, the Nephilim, the children of the Watchers, may have left behind a legacy that persists to this day in ways that most of us have never been equipped to recognize. This is the story of that legacy. This is the story of what was buried in the caves of Qumran and why it was buried, and what it means that we have finally dug it up. The earliest known reference to the Book of Giants in modern scholarship appears in the work of Wilhelm Bousset, the German theologian who in the late 19th century began cataloging references to a lost Enochic literature that appeared to have been far more extensive than the surviving Book of Enoch would suggest. Bousset noticed that ancient writers, Manichaean writers, early Christian fathers, Jewish rabbinical commentators, all made references to stories about the offspring of the Watchers, the fallen angels described in the Book of Enoch, that went far beyond what the surviving text contained. There were accounts of named giants, of specific deeds, of dreams and visions and divine messages that appeared in multiple independent sources, but could not be traced to any known document. Bousset concluded that there had once existed a more extensive body of literature about the giants, a book of giants, that had been lost. He was right. He simply could not know that it had not been lost at all. It had been hidden, and it was waiting to be found. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 and the subsequent discovery of additional caches of manuscripts in the years that followed changed everything. Among the hundreds of scrolls and scroll fragments recovered from the caves of Qumran, scholars identified pieces of at least 6 separate manuscripts of the Book of Giants. They were written in Aramaic, the common language of Jewish Palestine in the centuries immediately before and after the beginning of the Common Era. They were found in multiple caves, Cave 1, Cave 2, Cave 4, Cave 6, indicating that the text was not a single anomalous document, but a widely circulated work that had been copied and preserved across multiple manuscripts and across multiple generations of the Qumran community. This was not a marginal text that happened to survive by accident. This was a text that the people of Qumran considered important enough to copy and preserve in quantity. The Dead Sea Scrolls community, almost certainly the Essenes, a Jewish sect that flourished from the 2nd century BCE to the 1st century CE, clearly regarded the Book of Giants as significant religious literature. They preserved it alongside their copies of the Torah, the Psalms, the Prophets, and other texts that would eventually become the Hebrew Bible. They gave it the same care, the same reverence, the same deliberate protection. Someone decided that this text would not be allowed to survive into the mainstream. Someone decided that the story it told was too dangerous, too disruptive, too fundamentally incompatible with the version of history that needed to be established. Understanding who made that decision and why is one of the central tasks of this investigation. The official academic edition of the Book of Giants fragments was produced by the scholar Joseph Millick, who published his analysis in 1976 in his comprehensive study of the Books of Enoch. Millick's work is extraordinary, careful, rigorous, deeply learned, but it is also, in certain respects, deliberately limited in its interpretive ambition. Millick presents the fragments, analyzes their language and literary structure, identifies their connections to other Enochic literature, and then largely refrains from drawing broader historical or theological conclusions. This is the academic method. It is a method designed to protect scholarly careers rather than to pursue truth wherever it leads. The scholars who have worked most seriously with these texts have been constrained by the institutional cultures in which they operate. Cultures that reward narrow specialization and punish broad synthetic thinking. Cultures that have little patience for the kind of question that the Book of Giants most urgently demands. What does this mean for our understanding of where we come from? We are going to answer that question, but first we need to understand the world from which this text emerged. The caves of Qumran and what they contained. In the winter of 1946 or 1947, the exact date is disputed, the historical record muddied by the chaos of the period and the unreliability of the early accounts. A Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad ed-Dib, who was perhaps 15 years old and was tending his flock near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, threw a stone into a hole in the cliff face and heard it strike something unexpected. What he heard was the sound of clay pottery breaking. What was inside those clay jars, wrapped in linen and sealed against time, was one of the most significant collections of ancient documents ever recovered from the earth. The caves of Qumran had been holding their secrets for nearly 2,000 years. They were not ready to give them up easily. The site of Qumran sits on a dry plateau above the western shore of the Dead Sea in what is now the West Bank. The climate there is exceptional in terms of its preservative properties: arid, stable, sheltered from the extremes of weather that would destroy organic materials in most other environments on Earth. The Dead Sea itself sits at the lowest point on the Earth's surface, more than 400 meters below sea level, and the surrounding region receives almost no rainfall. Documents stored in clay jars in the limestone caves of this region can survive for centuries, for millennia, with a degree of preservation that is essentially impossible anywhere else on Earth with equivalent humidity and temperature variation. The people who hid the scrolls here knew what they were doing. They were not simply hiding these documents from immediate danger. They were preserving them for the long term. They were making a deposit against the future, entrusting their sacred literature to the desert in the hope, or perhaps the certainty, that it would eventually be recovered by people who needed to know what it contained. Who those people were is a matter of significant scholarly debate. The community most commonly identified with the Qumran site and with the production and preservation of the Dead Sea Scrolls is the Essenes, a Jewish sect described by the first-century historian Josephus, by the philosopher Philo of Alexandria, and by the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder. All three describe a community of ascetic Jewish men living near the Dead Sea, dedicated to purity, to communal property, to the study of scripture and ancient wisdom literature, and to a theology that placed enormous importance on cosmic dualism, the struggle between light and darkness, between the forces of good and the forces of evil, between God and the adversarial spiritual powers that opposed him. The Essenes were, by every account we have, deeply interested in the heavenly realm and its inhabitants. They believed that angels played an active and crucial role in human affairs. They believed that the history of the world was the story of a cosmic conflict between divine and adversarial spiritual beings, a conflict in which human beings were caught up as participants and witnesses, and they preserved, with enormous care, a body of literature that described that conflict in specific and extraordinary detail. The Dead Sea Scrolls, as a collection, are staggering in their scope and significance. They include the oldest known manuscripts of almost every book of the Hebrew Bible, manuscripts that predate by 1,000 years the texts that had previously served as the basis for modern biblical translations. They include extensive collections of liturgical texts, community rules, commentaries on scripture, hymns, and apocalyptic writings. They include the complete text of the Book of Enoch, or at least the Aramaic original from which the Ethiopic translation, the version that had survived in a single manuscript tradition, was derived, along with previously unknown Enochic writings that scholars had not even known to look for. And they include the fragments of the Book of Giants, scattered across multiple manuscripts in multiple caves, pieced together by scholars over decades of painstaking reconstruction. The recovery of the scrolls was not a clean or simple process. After the initial discovery in Cave 1 in 1947, the scrolls that were found there, the Great Isaiah Scroll, the Community Rule, the Habakkuk Commentary, and others, were purchased by various parties and eventually made their way into scholarly hands, though this process involved considerable controversy, backroom dealing, and the kind of institutional politics that tends to surround any discovery of enormous cultural and commercial value. Additional caves were discovered in subsequent years, Cave 2 in 1952, Caves 3 through 11 over the course of the 1950s, and each new discovery added to the collection of manuscripts and manuscript fragments that needed to be cataloged, conserved, and studied. By the time the international team of scholars that was assigned to edit and publish the scrolls had completed its work, several decades had passed. Some scrolls were published quickly. Others waited years, decades, before their contents were made available to the broader scholarly community. The delays were explained in various ways. The complexity of the work, the difficulty of the reconstruction, the limited resources available to the team. But many scholars and observers noted, with increasing frustration, that the delays seemed to be concentrated around certain categories of text. The texts that were most theologically unusual, most historically disruptive, most incompatible with established religious and academic orthodoxies. These were the texts that waited longest for publication. The Book of Giants waited decades. When Joseph Mielik finally published his edition of the Enoch texts, including the Book of Giants fragments, in 1976, he had been sitting on much of this material for nearly 20 years. His edition was comprehensive and authoritative. It was also, for all practical purposes, inaccessible to anyone who was not a professional scholar with specialized training in Aramaic paleography and the textual criticism of Second Temple Judaism. The general public, the people who would have most benefited from knowing that this text existed and what it contained, were effectively excluded from the conversation. This is not an accident. This is a pattern. It is the same pattern that has characterized the management of the Dead Sea Scrolls from the beginning. Full disclosure in principle, radical inaccessibility in practice. The scrolls are public knowledge. The conversation about what they mean is tightly controlled. Let us talk about what the Book of Giants fragments actually contain before we go deeper into the history and context that give them meaning. The surviving fragments are not complete. They are broken, lacunose, full of gaps where the ancient parchment has disintegrated or where portions of the manuscript simply did not survive. But they are enough to reconstruct the essential outline of the text, enough to understand its major characters and its major narrative movements, enough to grasp its extraordinary significance. The Book of Giants is a narrative text. It tells a story. And the story it tells is one of the most dramatic and disturbing in all of ancient literature. The text takes as its starting point the tradition established in the Book of Enoch, particularly in the section known as the Book of the Watchers, a tradition that describes how a group of divine beings, identified as the sons of God, or the Watchers, descended from heaven and took human women as their wives. This act, universally described in the ancient sources as a violation of the natural and divine order, produced offspring who were not fully divine and not fully human, beings of enormous size, enormous strength, and, according to the texts, enormous appetite for violence and destruction. These were the Nephilim, these were the giants, and the Book of Giants is their story. The fragments give us names. This is crucial. The canonical Genesis account gives us no names, just 2 verses and then silence. The Book of Giants gives us named individuals, named families, named communities of giants with specific characteristics, specific histories, specific roles in the narrative of the pre-flood world. We have Ohia and Mahwe, 2 of the most prominent giants in the text, who appear to be the most powerful and the most concerned about the judgment that is coming. We have Hahya, Ohia's brother, a figure of tremendous physical power. We have a list of other giants. Gilgamesh appears in some interpretations of the Aramaic fragments, a connection that aligns the Book of Giants with Mesopotamian epic tradition in ways that are extraordinary and that we will explore at length. We have Mahwe making a journey to find Enoch, the human prophet who has been taken up to the heavenly realm and who serves as a mediator between the giants and the divine throne, a messenger sent by the beings who created them to deliver the judgment that will end their existence. The narrative structure of the Book of Giants revolves around a series of dreams. The giants are dreaming terrifying dreams, visions of cosmic judgment, visions of tablets with writing on them, visions of destruction falling from the sky like fire. They do not understand what these dreams mean. They are beings of immense physical power but limited spiritual insight, a detail that is both theologically significant and psychologically fascinating. The giants, for all their might, are afraid. They are afraid of what their dreams are telling them. And they seek interpretation from the one being who can provide it. Enoch, the righteous man, the prophet who walks with God, and who has been granted access to the heavenly council where the fate of the world is decided. This narrative structure, the powerful seeking wisdom from the holy, the mighty humbled before the truth of divine judgment, is one of the most compelling in ancient religious literature, and it is entirely absent from the canonical biblical tradition. You cannot get it from your Bible, you can only get it from the Book of Giants. The dreams themselves are extraordinary. In one of the best preserved fragments, a giant named Mawe flies through the air, already a remarkable detail, suggesting a degree of supernatural capacity in these beings that goes beyond mere physical size. To find Enoch and relay the content of the terrifying visions that he and his brothers have experienced. In another fragment, we have a description of tablets with writing descending from the heavenly realm, a possible reference to the divine record of judgment, a cosmic ledger in which the deeds of the giants have been recorded and against which they are to be weighed. The imagery of the descending tablets appears in multiple ancient traditions. The tablets of destiny in Mesopotamian mythology, the tablets of the law given to Moses on Sinai, and its appearance in the Book of Giants connects this text to the broadest currents of ancient religious thought across the entire ancient Near East. The judgment scenes in the Book of Giants are remarkable for their specificity and their emotional intensity. This is not abstract theological declaration. This is a story about beings who know they are going to be destroyed and who are trying to understand why, trying to find some way to avoid the inevitable, trying to process the enormity of what is coming. The giants in the Book of Giants are, in a certain sense, tragic figures. They did not choose to be born. They did not choose to be what they are, the product of a union that violated the natural order, beings whose very existence constitutes a kind of cosmic error. Yet they are to be destroyed for that existence, destroyed along with the world they have corrupted, destroyed in the catastrophic purge that we know from the canonical tradition as the flood of Noah. The Book of Giants gives these beings a voice, a psychology, an interior life that makes their destruction genuinely disturbing in ways that the sanitized Genesis narrative does not even begin to approach. This is one of the reasons it was excluded. Not because it was theologically wrong, but because it was theologically human, because it made the story of divine judgment complicated in ways that the established tradition needed to keep simple. The fragments of the Book of Giants found at Qumran are not the only surviving witnesses to this tradition. The Manichaean tradition, the religion founded by the prophet Mani in 3rd century Persia, preserved substantial portions of the Book of Giants in translation, though in a form significantly adapted to Manichaean theological purposes. Mani, who claimed to be the final prophet in a line that included Zoroaster, the Buddha, and Jesus, incorporated the Book of Giants into his own extensive mythological system, and his followers produced translations of the text in Middle Persian, Sogdian, Uyghur, Chinese, and Coptic. A testament to the extraordinary geographic spread of Mani's religion and to the text's continued relevance across wildly different cultural contexts. The Manichaean versions of the Book of Giants differ from the Qumran Aramaic in significant ways, but the core narrative is recognizable. The Watchers, the Giants, the Dreams, the Judgment, the Flood. The tradition survived Qumran. It survived in the pages of Mani's sacred literature, copied and distributed across half the known world until the violent suppression of Manichaeism by both the Roman and the Persian empires brought even that tradition close to extinction. We are left with fragments, with translations of translations, with quotations preserved in the works of writers who were trying to refute the tradition rather than preserve it. But we have enough. We have more than enough. The physical recovery of the Qumran fragments themselves is a story of academic politics as much as archaeology. When the scrolls were first brought to scholarly attention, a small international team was assembled to work on their publication. This team, headquartered at the École Biblique in Jerusalem, was dominated by European scholars with close ties to the Catholic Church. This is not a conspiracy theory, it is a documented historical fact. The role of the Catholic Church in the management of the Dead Sea Scrolls publication process has been discussed and debated openly in scholarly literature for decades. The concern, expressed privately by many scholars and occasionally in public, was that certain scroll texts might be used to challenge or undermine traditional Christian theology. The response to that concern was not, as it should have been, a commitment to full and rapid disclosure. The response was a systematic slowdown of the publication process that kept the most sensitive texts out of public circulation for decades. Some scholars who have worked in this field estimate that texts which should have been published in the 1950s and 1960s were not released until the 1980s and 1990s, and in some cases until the 1990s and 2000s, after persistent public pressure and the eventual unauthorized publication of photographs of the scroll fragments forced the official editor's hand. It was not until 1991 that the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, which held a set of photographs of the unpublished scrolls, announced that it would make those photographs available to any qualified scholar who requested them. This decision effectively broke the monopoly of the official editorial team and opened the scrolls to wider scholarly scrutiny. The response from the official editors was indignant. They argued that the integrity of the scholarly process demanded that publication proceed through the proper channels under the control of the proper authorities. What they could not argue, because the evidence was too clear, was that those proper channels had been functioning at an acceptable pace. 2 generations of scholars had been denied access to primary documents of world historical significance because a small team of gatekeepers had decided that they, and they alone, should control when and how those documents reached the public. The story of the Dead Sea Scrolls is, in this respect, a microcosm of a much larger story, the story of how knowledge about the ancient world has been managed, curated, and in certain crucial instances suppressed by institutions with interests to protect. The Book of Giants was one of the texts that waited. By the time Melech's edition appeared in 1976, and the Qumran texts were slowly becoming available through subsequent editions and translations, the world had moved on. The excitement of the initial scrolls discoveries had faded. The general public was no longer paying close attention to what the caves of Qumran had yielded, and the extraordinary contents of the Book of Giants, its named giants, its dramatic narrative, its cosmological vision, its profound implications for our understanding of the biblical tradition and the ancient world, slipped quietly into the academic literature without ever generating the public conversation that they deserved. This is where we are today. Scholars know about the Book of Giants. They can read about it in academic journals. They can find Melech's edition in major research libraries. But the conversation that this text demands, the broad, public, open-ended conversation about what it means and what it implies, has never been had in any meaningful way. Until now. The world before the flood, Genesis and its silences. Every story has a version that gets told and a version that gets buried. The version of the pre-flood world that most people in the Western tradition have inherited is the version of Genesis, compact, carefully controlled, deliberately vague on the details that would make the story most disturbing. The version that was buried is the one we are reconstructing here. To understand the full scope of what was buried, we need to begin with what was preserved, with the Genesis account itself, and read it with fresh eyes, without the comfortable assumptions that centuries of tradition have layered over its disturbing surface. Genesis chapter 6 begins with a statement so strange, so apparently out of place in the larger narrative of the book, that generations of biblical scholars and theologians have scrambled to explain it away, to domesticate it, to reduce its strangeness to something manageable. The text reads, "When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose." The phrase that is translated as sons of God in modern English editions is, in the original Hebrew, Bene Elohim, literally, sons of the gods or sons of the divine beings. This phrase is not ambiguous in the Hebrew tradition. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, in Job, in the Psalms, this same phrase is used to refer unambiguously to divine or angelic beings, members of the heavenly court. The sons of God in Genesis 6 are not human. They are something else, something that descends from the heavenly realm and takes human women as wives, with results that are catastrophic for the earth. Then comes the verse that is the most problematic, the most contested, the most extensively commented upon in the entire tradition. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown, Nephilim. The Hebrew word is extraordinary. Its etymology is disputed, but almost certainly derives from the root naphal, which means to fall, making the Nephilim the fallen ones, or perhaps the those who fall upon others, a description of their violence rather than their origin. Some translators have rendered the word as giants, following the choice of the translators of the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that was produced in Alexandria in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. Those translators chose the Greek word gigantes, giants, and in doing so connected the biblical Nephilim with the Greek tradition of the giants, the offspring of earth and heaven whose story pervades Greek mythology. This connection is not coincidental. The scholars who produced the Septuagint were learned men who recognized that the Hebrew Nephilim and the Greek giants were versions of the same tradition, that what Genesis 6 described in 2 verses was the same cosmic event that the Greeks described in their mythology of the Titanomachy and the Gigantomachy, the wars between the gods and the primordial beings who had preceded them. 2 verses, that is all you get in the canonical Bible. 2 verses, and then the narrative pivots immediately to Noah. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. We are told that God regretted making human beings. We are told that he decided to destroy them with a flood, but that Noah found favor in his eyes. And then the narrative of the ark begins, and the Nephilim are never mentioned again, except for one brief, enigmatic reference in the Book of Numbers, where the Israelite spies sent to scout the land of Canaan report seeing the Nephilim there, people of enormous stature before whom the Israelites felt like grasshoppers. One brief reference, centuries after the flood, with no explanation of how beings who should have perished in the flood are still apparently alive and living in Canaan. No explanation, just a mention and then silence. The canonical tradition does not want to answer the questions it raises. It wants to move past them as quickly as possible. The rabbinical tradition, the collection of Jewish interpretive texts that developed over the centuries after the close of the Hebrew Bible canon, was not entirely comfortable with this silence. The rabbis were deeply troubled by Genesis 6. They were troubled by the identity of the sons of God, a phrase that seemed to imply the existence of divine beings who were capable of transgressing divine law, a theologically uncomfortable notion. And they were troubled by the Nephilim, whose existence pointed to a category of being that fit nowhere neatly in the traditional framework of God, humans, and angels. Several different interpretive strategies were developed to manage these difficulties. Some rabbis argued that the sons of God were not angels at all, but rather noble human men, the aristocratic descendants of Seth, who had intermarried with the common women descended from Cain. This interpretation has the advantage of removing any suggestion that divine beings could fall, that angels could sin, that the heavenly court could produce rebels. It has the disadvantage of making almost no sense of the text, which clearly identifies the sons of God as a category distinct from ordinary human beings. Other rabbis maintained the older interpretation that the sons of God were indeed divine beings of some kind, members of the heavenly court who descended to earth and took human wives, but insisted that this had been an isolated incident, a unique transgression that had been permanently addressed by the flood, and that it would be wrong to draw any broader conclusions from it about the nature of the divine or the structure of the heavenly realm. Both of these interpretive strategies were, in their different ways, attempts to contain the damage, to prevent the story of the Nephilim from becoming the launching point for the kind of broad cosmological inquiry that might threaten the established theological framework. What the rabbis were reacting against, what they were anxious to contain, was precisely the tradition represented by the Book of Giants and the broader Enochic literature. Because in that tradition, the story of Genesis 6 is not a minor episode. It is the central event of the pre-flood world. It is the catastrophe from which everything else derives: the corruption of the earth, the spread of violence and wickedness, the necessity of the flood, the destruction of an entire civilization. In the Enochic tradition, the sons of God are clearly and unambiguously identified as watchers, a specific order of divine beings whose function was to observe and protect the earth and its human inhabitants. Their transgression was deliberate, premeditated, and consequential on a cosmic scale, and their offspring, the giants, the Nephilim, were not simply large and violent men. They were genuinely hybrid beings, part divine and part human, possessed of capacities that ordinary human beings did not have and could not match, whose existence fundamentally disrupted the order that had been established by the Creator. The Book of Enoch, specifically the section known as the Book of the Watchers, which scholars date to the 3rd or 4th century BCE, but which preserves traditions that are certainly older, tells the story in the kind of detail that Genesis refuses. 200 watchers, led by a being named Shemhaza, took an oath together on the summit of a mountain called Hermon, a specific geographical location, a real mountain that sits on the border between what is now Lebanon and Syria, and descended to the earth to take human wives. They descended not merely because they found human women attractive, though the text says they did, but because they desired something more, something that human existence represented that their divine existence denied them, some form of physical embodiment and physical pleasure and physical creation that was available to human beings but not to beings of their nature. This desire, in the Enochic tradition, is presented not simply as lust, but as a kind of existential longing, a reaching across the boundary between the divine and the human that was forbidden precisely because it threatened to collapse a boundary that the Creator had established for reasons of cosmic order. The names of the Watchers are preserved in the Book of Enoch and in the related literature. Shemhaza leads the group, but the most consequential figure, the one most responsible for the specific nature of the corruption that follows, is a watcher named Azazel. Where Shemhaza's transgression is fundamentally one of sexual desire, Azazel's transgression is one of knowledge. Azazel teaches the human beings the secrets of heaven, metallurgy, the forging of weapons, the making of jewelry and cosmetics, astrology, the reading of the signs in the sky, and other forms of arcane knowledge that the divine council had determined should remain in the heavenly realm and not be given to human beings. The spread of this knowledge, the democratization of divine wisdom in a form that human beings were not ready to receive responsibly, is one of the primary causes of the corruption that makes the flood necessary. This is a remarkable idea, and it is one that has profound implications for our understanding of the ancient world and of the early history of human civilization. The sudden appearance, in the archaeological record, of metallurgy, of astronomy, of complex social organization, of the kinds of technological and cultural sophistication that characterize what we call the beginning of civilization. The Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants suggest that these things did not develop organically through purely human innovation. They were given. They were taught. They were the gift of beings who should not have given them. The offspring of the Watchers and the human women, the Nephilim, the giants, are described in the Book of Enoch in terms that make their nature absolutely clear. They are described as being of enormous physical stature. The text gives measurements that, taken literally, would place some of them at heights of 300 cubits, a number that would translate to somewhere between 400 and 500 feet, depending on the cubit standard used. These numbers are almost certainly not meant to be taken literally in the way that modern readers would take them. They are expressions of mythological enormity, the ancient world's way of saying unimaginably huge. But the underlying reality that the numbers point toward is not mythological. The giants were large. They were larger than ordinary human beings. They were larger enough to be genuinely fearsome, to inspire the kind of terror that the Israelite spies in Numbers felt when they encountered the descendants of the Nephilim in Canaan. The rabbinical literature is full of stories about the physical size of specific giant individuals. Og of Bashan, who according to various sources had a bed that was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. The figures encountered by the Israelites in the land of Canaan, who were described as belonging to the Rephaim, the Anakim, the Zamzumim, the Emites, different names for populations of large human or semi-human beings whose existence is treated as historical fact in the biblical narrative, even as the tradition becomes increasingly uncomfortable with the theological implications of that existence. The key insight of the Enochic tradition, the insight that the Book of Giants extends and elaborates, is that the existence of the giants was not merely a physical phenomenon, it was a spiritual and cosmic phenomenon. The giants were the product of a boundary violation, and they embodied that violation in every aspect of their nature. They were too large, too strong, too violent, too hungry, too powerful for the world they inhabited. They consumed everything available to them, and when they had consumed everything available, they turned on each other and on the human population that was not capable of defending itself against them. The pre-flood world described in the Enochic tradition is a world of total and catastrophic breakdown. A world in which the structures of natural and divine order that had governed creation from the beginning had been destroyed, in which violence and chaos reigned, in which the earth itself was crying out for relief. This is the context for the flood, not a petulant divine response to human sinfulness, as the Genesis narrative sometimes seems to suggest. A necessary cosmic intervention to end a crisis that had reached a point of no return. What Genesis gives you in 2 verses, the Enochic tradition and the Book of Giants give you in a full narrative with characters and psychology and cosmic stakes. And the question that must be asked is why? Why was the decision made to preserve only the 2-verse version, only the sanitized outline, only the bare minimum necessary to establish that the flood had a reason? The answer, which will become clearer as we proceed, is that the full version was too dangerous. Not dangerous in the sense of being immoral or obscene. The Book of Giants is, in its way, a profoundly moral text, deeply concerned with justice and judgment and the consequences of transgression. Dangerous in the sense that it made certain things too clear, too specific, too historically grounded. It made the pre-flood world too real, the Watchers too specific, the giants too named and documented to be safely dismissed as allegory or myth. It made the official story of human origins untenable in ways that the keepers of that story were not prepared to accept. So it was removed, and what replaced it were 2 verses that raised all the questions and answered none of them. 2 verses designed to acknowledge the tradition just enough to prevent its complete erasure while saying nothing that might actually explain it. The genius of what was done to the biblical text at this point, and it was, in a deeply troubling sense, a kind of genius, was to preserve the shadow of the truth while eliminating the substance. The Nephilim are there. The sons of God are there. The wickedness is there, and the judgment, and the flood. But the specificity is gone. The names are gone. The narrative is gone. What remains is enough to confirm that something happened, something that warranted a global catastrophe, but not enough to tell you what it actually was, who was actually involved, or what it actually means for our understanding of the world we inhabit. That kind of deliberate reduction, that kind of controlled revelation of the minimum, is not an accident of transmission or a result of the complexity of the canonization process. It is a decision. Someone made that decision, and understanding who made it and why requires us to go deeper into the history of the beings at the center of this story, the Watchers themselves. The Watchers, heaven's deserters and the secret they carried. The word Watcher is a translation of the Aramaic term RR, which literally means one who is awake, or one who watches. The term appears in the canonical Bible in the Book of Daniel, where it is used to describe divine beings who serve in the heavenly court, beings whose function is to observe, to report, to execute divine decisions in the earthly realm. In the canonical tradition, the Watchers appear only briefly and in a context that is deliberately mysterious. In the Enochic tradition, they are the central characters of one of the most dramatic narratives in all of ancient religious literature. And in the Book of Giants, the consequences of their choices are played out to their catastrophic conclusion. To understand the Watchers, you need to understand the cosmological worldview of the Second Temple period, the period of Jewish history running from the completion of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in the late 6th century BCE to its destruction by the Romans in 70 CE. This was the world that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was a world deeply influenced by Persian Zoroastrian ideas about cosmic dualism, the idea that the universe was the arena of an ongoing struggle between a good divine power and an evil adversarial power, and that this struggle manifested in human history in specific and traceable ways. It was also a world deeply influenced by the wisdom traditions of Mesopotamia, of Babylon and Assyria, and the older Sumerian civilization before them. Traditions that described a populated heavenly realm full of divine beings with specific functions and specific relationships to the human world. The Watchers in the Enochic tradition are a synthesis of these influences. They are members of the divine court, beings created by God to serve specific functions in the administration of creation, who make a choice that places them in rebellion against the divine order. The Book of the Watchers, the earliest and most foundational section of Book of Enoch, tells us that the Watchers were originally appointed to watch over the earth and its human inhabitants. This is their function, their purpose, their reason for existing in the relationship they have with the human world. But something goes wrong. The text describes how Shemihaza, the leader of the group, looked down from the heavenly realm and saw the daughters of human beings and was seized by desire, a desire so powerful that he was willing to do what no being of his kind had done before, violate the boundary between the divine and the human realms in the most fundamental way possible by taking a human wife and fathering children in the human world. The question of why this boundary existed and why its violation was so catastrophically wrong is one of the deepest questions that the Enochic tradition raises. The boundary between heaven and earth, between the divine and the human, is one of the foundational structures of the created order in virtually every ancient religious tradition. The gods live above, human beings live below. The interaction between these realms is governed by rules of communication through prayer and sacrifice, rules of mediation through priests and prophets, rules of divine self-revelation through specific controlled channels. When those rules are violated, when a divine being chooses to enter the human realm not as a messenger or mediator, but as a participant, not temporarily but permanently, not in the controlled and purposeful manner of divine intervention, but in the impulsive and self-interested manner of desire, the result is a fundamental disruption of the order on which the created world depends. This is what the Watchers do. They choose desire over duty, self-gratification over cosmic order, physical pleasure over the responsibilities of their divine station. And the consequences of that choice cascade through the created world in ways that eventually make its survival impossible without divine intervention. But the transgression of the Watchers is not only sexual, it is, as we have already noted, also epistemic, a transgression of the boundaries of knowledge. The specific knowledge that Azazel teaches to human beings, the knowledge of metalworking, of weapons making, of cosmetics, of astronomical observation, is not morally neutral information. In the context of the Enochic worldview, it is transformative in ways that change the fundamental character of human civilization. Before the Watchers descended, human beings lived within a certain set of natural limits. They knew what they could know from nature and from their own experience. The spread of divine knowledge, the secrets of heaven given to beings who had not earned them and were not ready for them, changes human beings in ways that make them more powerful, but also more dangerous, more capable of harm, more susceptible to the kinds of pride and violence that make the pre-flood world the catastrophe it becomes. There is something here that resonates deeply with other ancient traditions. The Greek myth of Prometheus, the titan who steals fire from the gods and gives it to human beings, who is punished eternally for this transgression, is an obvious parallel. So is the story of the Tower of Babel, in which human beings use their combined knowledge and capacity to attempt to build a structure that reaches heaven, and are stopped by divine intervention before they can succeed. So is the story of Adam and Eve and the tree of knowledge, the fruit that gives knowledge of good and evil, the serpent who is somehow also a divine being of some kind, the transgression of a divine boundary that results in expulsion from a state of perfect order into the chaotic and mortal world we actually inhabit. These are not coincidental parallels. They are different cultural expressions of the same ancient memory, the memory of a time when the boundary between the divine and the human was violated, when knowledge that should have remained in heaven was brought to earth, and when the consequences of that violation were catastrophic. The Enochic tradition and the Book of Giants are, in this respect, not a peripheral curiosity, but a key to understanding one of the most fundamental themes in the entire corpus of ancient religious thought. The 200 watchers who descend with Shemihaza to Mount Hermon are described as having specific areas of expertise, specific secrets of heaven that they teach to their human wives and, through them, to the broader human population. Azazel teaches metalworking and weapons. Shemihaza teaches the making of enchantments. Other watchers teach the cutting of roots, the knowledge of the clouds and the heavenly signs, astrology and divination, the knowledge of the earth and the secrets hidden within it. The list is comprehensive and specific. It reads not like the vague generalities of mythology, but like a curriculum, a systematic program of technological and intellectual transfer from the divine realm to the human. This is one of the details that makes the Enochic tradition so fascinating and so disturbing in its implications. The suggestion that the technological and cultural foundations of civilization as we know it were not the product of purely human ingenuity, but were given to human beings by beings who should not have given them at a time when the human world was not ready to receive them responsibly. The names of all 200 watchers are preserved in the Book of Enoch, and the specificity of this naming is itself significant. This is not the naming of mythological archetypes. These are not generic divine figures like Zeus or Odin or Vishnu, representations of cosmic forces given anthropomorphic form for the purposes of religious narrative. These are beings with specific names: Shemihaza, Artakof, Ramel, Kokabiel, Tamiel, Ramiel, Danel, Ezekiel, Barakiel, Asael, Armaros, Bateriel, Ananel, Zachiel, Samsapiel, Sadarel, Turel, Jomjael, Sariel, names in Aramaic that seem to have been carefully preserved across multiple textual traditions. The specificity of this naming tradition suggests that the authors of the Enochic literature believed they were recording historical fact, not inventing mythology. They were not writing a novel. They were preserving a memory. What happened to the Watchers after their descent is described in both the Book of Enoch and, in fragmentary form, in the Book of Giants. The Divine Council, outraged by the transgression, dispatches 4 archangels, Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel, to deal with the crisis. Raphael is sent to bind Azazel hand and foot and throw him into a pit in the desert of Dudael, where he is to wait, face down, in darkness and fire, until the day of judgment, when he will be cast into the fire of eternity. Shemihaza is bound as well, suspended between earth and sky, hanging face down above the mountains, a punishment that is both physically precise and symbolically resonant, placing the leader of the fallen Watchers in permanent suspension between the realm he abandoned and the realm he violated. The other Watchers are bound and imprisoned, their spirits confined, their physical forms destroyed in the catastrophe that destroys their children. The judgment of the Watchers is absolute and final. There is no redemption, no return, no mercy. The beings who created the giants are destroyed along with their creation. But here is where the tradition becomes most interesting and most complex. The Book of Enoch tells us that the spirits of the giants, the souls of the Nephilim who died in the flood, were not destroyed with their bodies. They were left without a home, without a body, without a realm to inhabit. And they became, in the Enochic tradition, something that the tradition calls evil spirits, or demons. Beings that wander the earth, seeking to enter human bodies, seeking to corrupt and destroy, carrying forward the legacy of violence and wickedness that characterized their existence in the flesh. The destruction of the giants physically did not destroy them spiritually. It transformed them into something arguably worse, into invisible, incorporeal agents of chaos that would continue to trouble the human world long after the flood that was supposed to end the problem. This is one of the most theologically significant points in the entire Enochic tradition, and it is one that connects directly to the New Testament and to the broader history of religious thought in the ancient Mediterranean world. The demonology of the New Testament, the pervasive assumption in the gospel narratives that the world is populated by malevolent spiritual beings who seek to possess and corrupt human beings, whose power can be confronted and broken by divine authority, is not intelligible without reference to this tradition. When Jesus casts out demons, when the early Christian writers describe spiritual warfare against principalities and powers in the heavenly places, when the apocalyptic literature of the New Testament describes the cosmic conflict between divine and adversarial spiritual forces, all of this is drawing on, and in many cases directly assuming, the cosmological framework of the Enochic tradition. The demons that trouble the world in the New Testament are, in this reading, the spirits of the giants. The adversarial spiritual powers that the early church believed were actively working against divine purposes in the world are, in this reading, the legacy of the Watchers. The excluded texts, the Book of Enoch, the Book of Giants, are the explanatory framework for theology that was kept while the explanation was discarded. You were given the theology of spiritual warfare. You were not given the history that explains where it came from. The implications of this are extraordinary. The canonical tradition preserves the theology derived from the Enochic worldview while systematically obscuring the historical narrative that gives that theology its meaning. Christians are told that the world is inhabited by evil spirits, that spiritual warfare is real, that the powers of darkness are active agents in human history, and they are told this as a matter of theological doctrine, of revealed truth about the nature of reality. But they are not told where these evil spirits came from, what they are, what their history is, because that history is the Book of Giants and the broader Enochic literature, and that literature was excluded from the canon. The result is a tradition that maintains the experiential and practical dimensions of the Enochic worldview, the reality of demonic influence, the necessity of spiritual protection, the power of divine authority over adversarial forces, while systematically denying its adherents the cosmological context that would make those dimensions fully intelligible. The Watchers, in the tradition that the Book of Giants preserves, are not simply literary characters. They are beings whose existence and whose transgression explain the shape of the world we inhabit. They explain why the world contains both the capacity for human greatness and the seeds of human self-destruction. They explain why knowledge can be both liberating and dangerous. They explain why the tradition of spiritual warfare, the sense that human beings are caught in the middle of a cosmic conflict that is far larger than they are, is not paranoia but perception. And they explain why the memory of their existence was so threatening to the established religious order that it had to be buried in clay jars in the caves of Qumran, hidden from the world that most needed to understand it. The specific knowledge that the Watchers imparted to human beings, the metallurgical secrets, the astronomical wisdom, the arts of warfare and ornamentation, shows up in the archaeological record at specific moments in human prehistory. The emergence of metalworking, of organized warfare, of astronomical observation as a systematic practice, of the kind of complex social organization that supports specialized knowledge production. These things do not appear gradually and uniformly across the human world. They appear suddenly, and they appear with a specificity and sophistication that puzzles archaeologists who try to explain them through purely incremental models of human technological development. The question of how these capacities emerged so suddenly, so fully formed, so quickly, is one of the central puzzles of ancient history. The Enochic tradition has an answer. Whether the mainstream academic world is prepared to take that answer seriously is a different matter, but the convergence between what the Book of Giants and the Enochic tradition describe, the sudden infusion of advanced knowledge into the human world through non-human agency, and what the archaeological record actually shows, is not something that can be dismissed without serious engagement with the evidence. The Watchers are also the key to understanding the universal, giant traditions of the ancient world. Every civilization on every continent has preserved memories of beings who were larger than ordinary human beings, more powerful, more connected to the divine realm, yet ultimately corrupt or corrupted, ultimately destructive, ultimately destroyed by the forces of cosmic order, the Titans of Greek mythology, the Jotuns of Norse tradition, the Asura of Hindu cosmology, the Anakim and Rephaim of Canaanite tradition, the Anunnaki of Sumerian mythology. These are not independent inventions by separate cultures constructing similar myths out of similar psychological needs. They are parallel traditions, preserving in different cultural languages the same underlying historical memory, the memory of the Watchers and their offspring, the memory of beings who were more than human and less than divine, whose existence disrupted the established order and whose destruction was necessary to restore it. The Book of Giants is the most specific, the most detailed, the most historically grounded of all these traditions. It is the text that connects them all, and it is the text that was buried most deliberately, most systematically, most successfully, until the caves of Qumran gave it back. The Giants, names, natures, and terrible deeds. They walked the earth before the flood. They were enormous in body and catastrophic in appetite. They bore names that the ancient writers recorded with the same precision reserved for the names of kings and prophets, because in the world they inhabited, they were both. They were the rulers of the pre-flood world, the dominant force in a civilization that the flood was designed to eliminate entirely. The Book of Giants gives them an existence, a psychology, a narrative arc that the canonical Bible was not willing to preserve. Let us enter that narrative. The most prominent giants in the surviving Book of Giants fragments are Ohya and Maweh. They appear to be brothers, or at least closely related, and they are presented as among the most powerful of the Nephilim, beings whose strength is matched only by their growing terror in the face of the dreams and visions that are coming to them. Ohya's name appears in Aramaic as Oya, and some scholars have suggested a connection to the word for serpent or viper, a detail that may connect this figure to the serpentine imagery that pervades ancient Near Eastern depictions of primordial monsters and chaos beings. Maweh's name appears to derive from an Aramaic root connected to life or vitality. Together, these two figures represent the dominant intelligence of the giant community, the beings who are capable of recognizing the significance of the visions that are troubling the giant world, and who take the initiative of seeking out Enoch to understand what those visions mean. The dreams of the giants are the central narrative device of the Book of Giants, and they are described in the surviving fragments with a vividness that suggests the original text was a work of considerable literary power. In one of the most significant dream sequences, a giant, the text is fragmentary and the name is not entirely clear, but it appears to be Maweh, has a vision of a tablet being immersed in water. The tablet bears all the names of the giants, all 300, and when it emerges from the water, 2/3 of the names have been washed away. Only 1/3 remains. This is a vision of the flood and its consequence, a direct divine communication delivered in the symbolic language of dreams, informing the giants that the judgment has been decided, that most of them will be destroyed, that only a remnant will survive. The precision of the fraction, 2/3 destroyed, 1/3 remaining, is itself significant. This is not a vision of total annihilation. It is a vision of partial judgment, a judgment that leaves something intact. What that surviving remnant represents in the theological logic of the text is one of the fascinating questions that the fragmentary state of the document makes it impossible to answer definitively. Another dream sequence, attributed to Ohya in the fragments, involves a vision of a tree being uprooted. The tree is enormous, its roots go deep into the earth, its branches reach the sky, and it is surrounded by 3 other trees. When the great tree is uprooted, the other 3 remain standing. This imagery is immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the broader tradition of ancient Near Eastern dream symbolism. Trees represent kingdoms, rulers, cosmic orders. The uprooting of the great tree is the destruction of the dominant power of the pre-flood world, the world of the giants, the world that the Watchers created with their transgression. The 3 trees that remain may represent the divine order that will persist after the judgment, or they may represent the human survivors of the flood, Noah and his family, and the lineages they represent. The dream is not interpreted within the surviving fragments, which is frustrating, but its imagery is consistent with the broader narrative arc of the text. The most dramatic section of the Book of Giants that survives is the account of Mahwe's journey to find Enoch. Mahwe, and this is one of the most extraordinary details in the entire text, travels through the air to reach Enoch. He crosses water, crosses mountains, and arrives at the place where Enoch dwells, which the text describes in terms that suggest a location beyond the ordinary human world, a place at the edge of the earth or beyond it, where the human prophet has been taken up by the divine council to serve as a mediator between heaven and earth. The capacity for flight attributed to Mahwe is significant. It suggests that the giants were not simply large human beings. They were beings with capacities that exceeded the normal human range, capacities that derived from the divine element in their nature, from the fact that they were the offspring of heavenly beings. The giants of the Book of Giants are not mythological brutes. They are complex beings possessed of genuine power, capable of genuine action in the world, confronting a genuine crisis. Enoch's response to Mahwe's message is preserved in fragments that are tantalizingly incomplete. The prophet dictates a reply, a letter apparently addressed to the giants, that conveys the judgment of the divine council. The letter tells the giants that their petition for mercy has been heard but will not be granted. Their fathers, the Watchers, have been judged and imprisoned, and the giants themselves must face the consequences of an existence that was never supposed to be. Enoch's message is not without compassion. There is in the surviving fragments a quality of genuine grief, a recognition of the tragedy of the giant's situation, but it is unequivocal about the outcome. The judgment is final. The destruction is coming. There is no escape and no reprieve. What the giants must do is prepare themselves, spiritually, psychologically, for what is inevitable. This exchange between Mahwe and Enoch is one of the most remarkable things in all of ancient literature, and it is almost entirely unknown to the general public. It represents a tradition of negotiation between the condemned and the divine that has no parallel in the canonical biblical tradition, where the pre-flood human population and the Nephilim alike are destroyed without any recorded conversation between the doomed and the divine. The canonical Genesis account is notable for its silence. Noah is saved, the rest of the world is destroyed, and there is no recorded appeal, no recorded response, no recorded moment of recognition on the part of the beings who are about to die. The Book of Giants fills that silence. It gives the condemned a voice, a psychology, a narrative of confrontation with their fate that is deeply, genuinely human in its emotional register, even though the beings doing the confronting are not human. This is what made the text dangerous. This is what made it necessary to exclude it. A sympathetic portrayal of the Nephilim, beings whose destruction the canonical tradition presents as unambiguously just, threatens the entire framework of simple divine justice that the official story depends on. Beyond Oya and Mahwe, the Book of Giants preserves references to other giant figures whose names and characteristics align with traditions found across the ancient Near East. There is a figure whose name in the Aramaic fragments has been reconstructed by scholars as Gilgamesh, or at least a name phonetically close to Gilgamesh, which, if the reconstruction is correct, would represent a direct connection between the Book of Giants and the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, the great Babylonian epic poem that is one of the foundational texts of world literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells the story of a king of Uruk who is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a hybrid being, a man of extraordinary physical power who embarks on a quest for immortality after the death of his companion Enkidu. Gilgamesh, in the Babylonian tradition, is the son of the goddess Ninsun and a human father, a divine-human hybrid whose extraordinary capacities derive from his mixed nature. If the Book of Giants does indeed contain a reference to Gilgamesh, it would suggest that the Gilgamesh of the Mesopotamian tradition and the giants of the Enochic tradition are versions of the same figure, that the ancient Mesopotamian epic and the ancient Enochic text are both preserving, in different cultural languages, the memory of the same category of being, the offspring of divine and human parents, larger than life, possessed of capacities beyond the ordinary human range, ultimately mortal and ultimately doomed. The connection between the Book of Giants and the Gilgamesh tradition is not merely a matter of a shared name. The thematic parallels are deep and pervasive. Both traditions center on beings of hybrid divine human nature who are ultimately confronted with their mortality. Both include flood narratives. The Gilgamesh epic contains one of the most extensive flood narratives in all of ancient literature, the story of Utnapishtim, which scholars have long recognized as a close parallel to the biblical story of Noah. Both include traditions of divine beings who descend to or interact with the human world in ways that disrupt the established cosmic order. Both culminate in a divine judgment that destroys the old world and makes room for a new one. The Gilgamesh tradition and the Enochic tradition are not independent inventions. They are the same tradition, expressed in different cultural vocabularies, preserved by different communities across different centuries. The Book of Giants is the Jewish expression of what the Gilgamesh epic preserves in Babylonian form. They are telling the same story about the same beings and the same catastrophe. The physical characteristics of the giants as described across the various sources, the Book of Giants, the Book of Enoch, the rabbinical literature, the biblical narrative, converge on several consistent traits. They are large, obviously, so large that the human beings who encounter them feel like grasshoppers in their presence, as the Israelite spies report in the Book of Numbers. They are violent. The Book of Enoch tells us that they consumed everything available to them, and when animals and cultivated produce were exhausted, they turned to human flesh, becoming cannibals who devastated the human population. They are knowledgeable. They have inherited from their Watcher fathers access to forms of understanding and capacity that ordinary human beings do not possess. And they are, despite all this power, afraid of the dreams that are coming to them, afraid of the judgment that those dreams foretell, afraid in ways that are deeply recognizable as fear, that familiar human experience of being confronted with something larger than oneself that one cannot control or escape. The violence of the giants is a central theme in both the Book of Enoch and what survives of the Book of Giants. The text is specific about the nature of this violence in ways that the canonical tradition absolutely refuses to be. The giants consume not only animal flesh, but human flesh. They drink not only water, but blood. They engage in forms of violence against each other and against the human population that make the pre-flood world a place of total horror. A world in which ordinary human beings have no recourse, no protection, no defense against beings of enormous physical power who recognize no limit to their appetites and no authority over their behavior. This is the world that the flood is designed to end. Not a world of ordinary human sinfulness, of lying, of theft, of social injustice, of religious infidelity. A world of total civilizational breakdown. A world in which the predation of the giants has made ordinary human existence impossible. A world crying out for the kind of intervention that only a global catastrophe can provide. This has important implications for our understanding of the flood narrative itself. If the pre-flood world was the world the Book of Giants describes, a world dominated by hybrid divine human beings of enormous power and violence, a world in which ordinary human civilization had been overwhelmed and corrupted by these beings, then the flood was not a punishment of human sinfulness in the ordinary sense. It was the elimination of a specific existential threat. It was the removal from the earth of beings whose existence was incompatible with the survival of humanity and of the created order as the divine had established it. The flood was not, in this reading, primarily a story about human moral failure. It was primarily a story about the judgment of the Nephilim, a story that the Book of Giants tells from the perspective of the giants themselves, giving them a voice and a psychology that the canonical tradition was not willing to grant them, but a voice that makes the necessity of their destruction, paradoxically, more comprehensible, not less. The legacy of the giants in the canonical biblical tradition is sparse, but consistently suggestive. After the flood, the Nephilim are supposed to be gone. The flood was specifically designed to destroy them, and yet they keep appearing. The Anakim of Canaan, the opponents encountered by the Israelite spies, are described as descendants of the Nephilim. Og of Bashan, the king of a Transjordanian nation encountered and defeated by the Israelites as they moved toward the Promised Land, is described in the text of Deuteronomy as the last of the Rephaim, the last of the giants, and his iron bed, 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, is mentioned as proof of his extraordinary size. Goliath of Gath, the champion of the Philistines whom David famously defeats, is described in the older manuscript tradition as being 4 cubits and a span in height, approximately 6 feet 9 inches in modern terms, though some manuscript traditions place him at 6 cubits and a span, which would be approximately 9 feet 6 inches, a height that goes significantly beyond the range of normal human variation. And there are references in the books of Samuel and Chronicles to other Philistine warriors of unusual size and unusual physical characteristics, including one figure described as having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, a description that appears in other ancient traditions as well, and that some researchers have connected to a specific genetic condition associated with certain lineages of unusual size. The persistence of giant figures in the canonical biblical narrative after the flood raises a theological and historical question that the tradition has never adequately answered. How did they survive? The flood was supposed to destroy everything, every living creature on the face of the earth, except for those preserved on the ark. If the Nephilim were destroyed in the flood, how are their descendants encountered centuries later in Canaan and Transjordan? The traditional theological answer, that the post-flood giants were the product of a second incidence of the sons of God taking human wives, a possibility that Genesis 6:4 seems to allude to with its phrase, "and also afterward," is theologically uncomfortable because it implies that the flood failed to permanently solve the problem it was designed to address. The alternative answer, that certain of the giants or their immediate descendants survived the flood, either on the ark or through some other means, is even more theologically uncomfortable because it would mean that Noah was not the sole survivor of the pre-flood world and that the divine plan for a fresh start for humanity was not entirely successful. The Book of Giants does not fully resolve this question. The surviving fragments do not include what would presumably have been the climactic flood sequence, but it raises it in ways that demand engagement. The dream vision of the tablets, with 2/3 of the names washed away and 1/3 remaining, is a possible clue. Perhaps the tradition preserves a memory of partial survival, of giants or giant bloodlines that persisted through the flood into the post-flood world, carrying forward the genetic and spiritual inheritance of the Watchers into a world that had been purged but not entirely renewed. This possibility that the flood did not accomplish the complete elimination of the Nephilim lineages is one of the most disturbing implications of the broader tradition, and one that connects, as we will see, to a wide range of physical and archaeological evidence that the mainstream academic world has been remarkably reluctant to discuss. The Book of Giants, what the text actually says. Let us go directly to the text. Not the interpretation, not the implications, not the historical context, but the actual words, the actual fragments, the actual narrative that the Book of Giants preserves. This is necessary because one of the ways in which this text has been effectively suppressed is by keeping its actual content inaccessible. People may know that it exists. They may know in a general way that it describes giants and watchers and pre-flood catastrophe. But very few people have actually read the fragments, or had the fragments read to them in a way that conveys their full force. The fragments are extraordinary. They deserve to be heard. The opening of the Book of Giants is not fully preserved, but from the context of the Qumran fragments and the parallels in the Manichaean versions, scholars have been able to reconstruct its general shape. The text opens by establishing the situation of the giants, their existence in the pre-flood world, their relationship to the Watchers who fathered them, their dominion over the earth. The giants are presented as the rulers of the world, beings of enormous power who exercise authority over the human population and over the natural world in ways that the text makes clear are fundamentally illegitimate, not because they lack power, but because that power derives from a transgression. They are rulers who should not be rulers, kings who should not have been born. The first substantial preserved fragment, found in Cave 4 at Qumran and designated 4Q530, contains what scholars believe to be an account of a gathering of the giants, a kind of council or assembly in which the disturbing dreams that have been coming to them are discussed. The text describes the giants as deeply troubled. They have been experiencing visions that they cannot interpret, dreams that seem to carry cosmic significance but whose meaning they cannot access. The atmosphere the text conveys is one of anxiety and foreboding, beings of immense power confronting something that their power cannot address, beings who have never known fear discovering that they are afraid. The psychological reality of this is striking. The giants were feared by everything in the world they inhabited. Now they are the ones who are afraid. The reversal is not incidental. It is central to the theological logic of the text. In 4Q530, column 2, one of the best preserved sections of the entire Book of Giants, we have what appears to be the account of a giant, possibly Ohya, relating a terrifying dream. The text is partially broken, but the surviving portions convey a vision of violence and cosmic upheaval, of fire raining down from the sky, of the earth being convulsed, of the established order of the world being overturned. The dream is not presented as an ordinary night vision. It is presented as a message, a communication from beyond the ordinary realm of experience, a direct signal from the divine council that the age of the giants is ending and that their destruction is coming. The giant recounts this vision to the other giants assembled, and the text conveys their collective response, a response that scholars have described as a mixture of terror, disbelief, and desperate denial. These are beings who have never confronted anything more powerful than themselves. The idea that something is coming that they cannot fight, cannot intimidate, cannot overwhelm by force. This idea is genuinely incomprehensible to them, and yet they cannot deny what the dreams are telling them. The account of Maway's journey to Enoch is preserved in a fragment from Cave 4, 4Q531, and it is one of the most remarkable things in all the Dead Sea Scrolls literature. The fragment describes Maway rising into the air. The Aramaic uses a term that clearly describes flight and traveling to the place where Enoch dwells. The geography of this journey is extraordinary. Maway crosses waters, crosses mountains, crosses what the text seems to describe as the edge of the inhabited world. He is traveling not just through physical space, but through the boundary between the ordinary world and the realm where Enoch has been taken, the edge of heaven, the place where the divine and human realms touch. When he arrives, he delivers to Enoch the content of the giants' terrifying visions, and he asks, on behalf of all the giants, that Enoch intercede with the divine council on their behalf. He asks for mercy. He asks for explanation. He asks for some way out of the situation in which he and his kind find themselves. The desperation in the text is palpable, even across 2,000 years and the fragmentary state of the manuscript. Enoch's response is delivered not in person, but in writing, a letter dictated by Enoch and carried back to the giants by Maway. The letter, preserved in fragmentary form in 4Q530, is one of the most extraordinary documents in ancient religious literature. It begins by acknowledging that the giants have sent Maway to him as a petitioner, that their message has been received. It then tells them, in terms of absolute finality, that the petition for mercy will not be granted. The text uses the language of the heavenly court, the language of divine decree, of cosmic judgment, of decisions that cannot be appealed because they have been made at the highest level of the universal order. The giants' fathers, the Watchers, have been judged and imprisoned. Their works, the knowledge they spread, the children they fathered, the corruption they introduced into the created world, have been judged and found to be destructive beyond remedy. And the giants themselves, as the product of that forbidden union and the agents of that catastrophic corruption, must be destroyed along with the world they have ruined. What is extraordinary about the letter as it is preserved is its tone. It is not triumphalist. It does not celebrate the judgment. It does not present the destruction of the giants as a moment of divine satisfaction or as the simple and deserved consequence of wickedness. It is, rather, a document of deep and genuine gravity, an acknowledgement of the tragedy of the situation, of the fact that the giants did not choose to be what they are, that their nature is the result of a transgression for which they bear some but not complete responsibility. Enoch in this letter is not a prophet of divine vengeance. He is a messenger of divine necessity, conveying a decision that is not arbitrary or vindictive, but that is required by the nature of what has been done and what has resulted from it. The giants must die because the world they inhabit cannot be restored to health while they exist in it. The judgment is just, but it is also, in some sense, tragic. And the Book of Giants is the only text in the entire tradition that is honest enough to say so. The Manichaean versions of the Book of Giants, which were discovered in the course of German and British archaeological expeditions to Central Asia in the early 20th century, complement the Qumran Aramaic fragments in important ways. The Manichaean versions are in various languages: Middle Persian, Sogdian, Uyghur, Coptic, and they reflect a significant adaptation of the original material to Manichaean theological purposes. Mani was deeply interested in the tradition of the Watchers and the Giants because it resonated with his own cosmic dualism. His belief that the universe was the arena of a struggle between a good divine power, the Father of Greatness, the realm of light, and an evil adversarial power, the Prince of Darkness, the realm of matter and darkness. The giants, in the Manichaean adaptation, become figures in this cosmic drama, beings of mixed light and darkness, whose destruction is part of the larger process by which the realm of light is ultimately separated from and liberated from the realm of darkness. The Manichaean versions change many details and introduce many Manichaean-specific theological ideas that are not present in the Qumran original, but they also preserve, in some cases, narrative details that are not found in the Qumran fragments, details that suggest the original Book of Giants was a much more extensive text than what we have recovered from the Qumran caves. One of the most important Manichaean fragments, a text in Middle Persian known as the Kawan fragment, describes a confrontation between the giants and a divine being, possibly Raphael, who has come to execute the judgment against them. The giants attempt to resist. They fight. The text conveys their physical power in terms that are genuinely impressive. These are not beings who go quietly into destruction, who accept their fate without struggle. They fight with everything they have, and they lose. The divine power that confronts them is not defeatable by physical strength, however enormous. This confrontation, the battle between the giants and the divine executors of judgment, is one of the most dramatic sequences in the entire tradition, and it is one that connects the Book of Giants to the broader ancient tradition of primordial battles between divine and chaotic forces. The Babylonian Enuma Elish and the battle between Marduk and Tiamat, the Greek Theogony and the Titanomachy, the Norse Edda and the battle between the Aesir and the Jotuns. These are all versions of the same cosmic drama. The Book of Giants is not a peripheral Jewish text with no connection to the broader currents of ancient thought. It is one of the primary expressions of a tradition that pervades the entire ancient world. The most sobering detail preserved in the Manichaean versions is a narrative about what happens to the spirits of the giants after their physical destruction. This is the detail that the Book of Enoch treats briefly: the transformation of the giant spirits into the evil spirits or demons that continue to trouble the post-flood world. But the Manichaean version elaborates it in ways that are deeply disturbing in their implications. The spirits of the giants do not simply become generic evil spirits. They retain something of their individual identity, their individual character, their individual capacity for harm. They become specific agents of specific kinds of destruction, and they are not confined to the ancient world. They persist. They are present in the world that emerged after the flood. They are present in the world of the readers of the Manichaean texts in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, and they are, according to the tradition, present still, disembodied, invisible, seeking bodies to inhabit, seeking human beings through whom to express the violence and appetite that characterized their physical existence before the flood. This is the most challenging claim of the entire tradition, and the one that is most difficult to evaluate using conventional historical and scientific methods. The Book of Giants, through its connection to the broader Enochic tradition and through the Manichaean preservation of its themes, makes a claim about the present state of the world, a claim that the destruction of the giants' physical bodies did not end the problem of their existence, that their spiritual legacy continues to operate in the world, that the beings who terrified the pre-flood world are still, in some form, here. This is a claim that intersects in fascinating and disturbing ways with the demonology of the New Testament, with the tradition of exorcism in the early church, with the pervasive human experience across cultures and centuries of malevolent non-human influences on human thought and behavior. It is a claim that cannot be evaluated by archaeology or paleontology or genetic analysis. It is a claim that belongs to a different domain of inquiry, a domain that our scientific civilization has declared off limits, has decided to treat as the territory of superstition and irrationality. Whether that decision is correct is a question that the Book of Giants forces us to ask with fresh urgency. The relationship between the Book of Giants and the canonical scriptures it was excluded from is not simply one of competition between two different versions of the same story. It is a relationship of complement and context. The Book of Giants explains things that the canonical scriptures describe, but do not explain. It fills in gaps that the canonical narrative deliberately left open. It gives names and faces and psychological depth to beings who appear in the canonical tradition as footnotes: the Nephilim of Genesis 6, the Rephaim of the books of Samuel, the Anakim of the spy narrative in Numbers. Without the Book of Giants, these figures are mysterious and unexplained. With it, they are comprehensible, still disturbing, still theologically challenging, but comprehensible as figures in a coherent historical and cosmological narrative. The exclusion of the Book of Giants from the canon did not make the canonical tradition cleaner or more coherent. It made it more confusing. It removed the explanatory framework that makes the canonical narrative's references to giants and Nephilim and divine beings intelligible. What was left was a tradition full of mysteries that it pretended were not mysteries, a tradition that referenced a world it refused to explain. The Great Suppression: who decided what you would believe? The canon of the Bible, the list of books that are considered authoritative scripture, did not fall from heaven. It was not delivered complete and perfect to the first generation of believers. It was constructed, debated, argued over, and ultimately decided by human beings operating within specific political and theological contexts, with specific interests to protect and specific agendas to advance. Understanding who made these decisions, how they made them, and what they were trying to achieve is essential to understanding why the Book of Giants and the broader Enochic literature were excluded. Because the exclusion was not an accident, it was not the product of disinterested theological judgment. It was a political act carried out by people who understood that the control of sacred texts is the control of the minds and souls of the people who believe in them. The history of the biblical canon is long and complicated, and it is a history that mainstream religious institutions have generally preferred to present in the most favorable possible light, as a process of genuine theological discernment, guided by divine inspiration, resulting in a body of scripture that reflects the authentic tradition of the people of God. This presentation is not entirely false, but it is not entirely true either. The actual history of how the canon was assembled is a story of controversy, political pressure, theological warfare, and institutional power plays that make it impossible to view the final product as anything other than what it is: a selection of texts made by human beings at a particular historical moment for particular historical reasons, with the result that some texts were included and some were excluded, not purely on the basis of their spiritual or historical value, but on the basis of their compatibility with the theological and political requirements of the institutions that were making the choices. The Jewish canon, the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, was essentially finalized at the Council of Jamnia, a gathering of Jewish scholars that took place around 90 CE, shortly after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans. This council made definitive decisions about which texts belonged to the Hebrew scriptures and which did not. The criteria they applied included antiquity. Texts had to be old enough to be considered from the period of genuine prophecy. Language. Preference was given to texts in Hebrew over those in Greek or Aramaic, and consistency with the emerging rabbinic tradition. Texts whose content was difficult to reconcile with the direction in which rabbinic Judaism was moving were excluded. The Enochic literature failed on multiple counts. Worst Enoch was available primarily in an Aramaic version rather than a Hebrew original, though the Qumran discoveries suggest that Hebrew versions may have existed. Its theology, with its emphasis on the Watchers, the Giants, and the ongoing activity of evil spirits in the world, was difficult to reconcile with the rabbinic tradition's increasingly cautious approach to angelology and demonology, and its account of the pre-flood world implied a cosmological complexity and a history of divine-human boundary violations that the rabbinic tradition found theologically problematic. The Book of Giants was excluded along with 1 Enoch for the same reasons and with the same result. The Christian canon's development is even more complex and even more explicitly political. The early Christian movement produced an enormous variety of texts: Gospels, epistles, apocalypses, wisdom texts, narrative accounts of the apostles, and the question of which of these texts were authoritative was the subject of intense controversy from the very earliest period of the movement's existence. Different Christian communities in different parts of the ancient world used different texts, regarded different collections as authoritative, and disagreed bitterly about the status of any number of specific documents. Lists of canonical texts began to circulate in the 2nd and 3rd centuries: the Muratorian canon, the list associated with Origen, the list in Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, but none of these lists achieved universal acceptance, and significant regional variation persisted well into the 4th century. The definitive moment, or what is conventionally presented as the definitive moment, came in 367 CE when the bishop Athanasius of Alexandria sent his annual festal letter to the churches under his authority and included in it a list of the 27 books of what we now call the New Testament, described as the only legitimate scriptures for Christian use. This list, which corresponds exactly to the New Testament as it appears in modern Bibles, was subsequently endorsed by various church councils and eventually became standard throughout most of the Christian world. What made Athanasius's list authoritative? Power, primarily. Athanasius was the bishop of Alexandria, the most important Christian see in the Eastern Mediterranean. He was also a figure of enormous influence in the broader church, having survived multiple imperial exiles and multiple theological controversies to become the dominant voice in 4th century Christian theology. When Athanasius spoke, the churches listened, not because his theological judgment was necessarily superior to anyone else's, but because he occupied a position of institutional authority that gave his pronouncements practical weight. The texts he included in his list were the texts that the mainstream institutional church would use. The texts he excluded were the texts that the mainstream institutional church would not use, and would, in many cases, actively suppress. The role of Constantine the Great and the Roman imperial government in the development of the Christian canon cannot be overstated, and it is consistently underestimated in popular accounts of this history. Constantine's conversion to Christianity, or at least his decision to adopt Christianity as the favored religion of the Roman Empire, transformed the movement from a persecuted minority into an imperial institution almost overnight. And with this transformation came entirely new pressures and incentives. An imperial religion needed a stable, unified, consistent body of doctrine and scripture. A church that served the political purposes of the Roman Empire needed to be predictable, controllable, and institutional in its character. The wild theological diversity of the early Christian movement, with its competing gospels, competing cosmological systems, competing visions of the divine, was incompatible with the needs of an imperial religion. Constantine needed the church to be unified. The church's leaders, who suddenly found themselves in a position of enormous imperial favor and patronage, had every incentive to cooperate with this demand for unity. The result was the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, which addressed the Arian controversy and established the Nicene Creed, and the subsequent process of doctrinal and canonical consolidation that produced the Bible as we know it. The Nicene process was not a neutral process of theological discernment. It was, in a very concrete sense, a political process, a process of institutional consolidation designed to produce a Christianity that was compatible with imperial governance and imperial culture. Texts that fit this project were included in the emerging canon, Texts that did not fit were excluded. The criteria for inclusion were not simply spiritual authenticity or historical reliability. They were, at least in part, political. Does this text serve the purposes of the institution we are building? Does this text support the kind of stable, hierarchical, institutionally managed Christianity that the empire needs? The Enochic literature, and the Book of Giants in particular, failed this test spectacularly. A text that described divine beings falling into corruption, that described the pre-flood world as dominated by violent hybrid beings created by the sexual transgression of heavenly entities, that preserved memories of a cosmic history far more complex and far more disturbing than the clean narrative of creation, fall, redemption that was becoming the orthodox Christian framework. This text was not compatible with the institutional Christianity that Constantine and Athanasius and the Council of Nicaea were building. It had to go. The process by which the Enochic literature was excluded from the Christian canon is not fully documented because those who carried out the exclusion did not write down their reasons in ways that survived. We can reconstruct the theological and political logic of the exclusion from the context, from what we know about the theological controversies of the 2nd through 4th centuries, from the criticisms of the Enochic tradition that appear in the works of various church fathers, from the patterns of what was included and what was excluded in the emerging canon. The church fathers who comment on the Book of Enoch are, almost without exception, critics. They regard the text with suspicion. They acknowledge that it was widely used in early Christian communities. The Epistle of Jude quotes directly from the Book of Enoch, and the imagery of the fallen angels is pervasive in early Christian demonology, but they argue against its canonical status on various grounds. Origen argues that the Book of Enoch's cosmology is too speculative. Julius Africanus argues that the sons of God in Genesis 6 were human rather than divine. Augustine of Hippo, in the 5th century, provides perhaps the most influential theological argument against the Enochic tradition, arguing in the City of God that the sons of God who took human wives could not have been angels or divine beings, because divine beings are not capable of physical reproduction. Augustine's argument is transparently motivated by theology rather than by textual analysis. He needs the Enochic tradition to be wrong because accepting it would require him to accept a cosmological complexity that his theological system cannot accommodate. But Augustine's influence in the Western Church was enormous, and his rejection of the Enochic tradition became the official position of Western Christianity for over a millennium. The Eastern Church's relationship with the Enochic tradition was somewhat more complex. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest continuously existing Christian institutions in the world, with roots reaching back to the 4th century CE, never excluded the Book of Enoch from its canon. It remains canonical in the Ethiopian Church to this day, preserved in the ancient Ge'ez language and read as authoritative scripture by a Christian tradition that has never accepted the Augustinian rejection of its cosmological claims. This is an extraordinary fact that deserves more attention than it typically receives. There is a Christian tradition, a major, ancient, entirely legitimate Christian tradition, that has always maintained the canonical status of the Book of Enoch. The idea that the Book of Enoch is heretical or non-canonical is not a universal Christian position. It is a position of the Western and Eastern mainstream churches, adopted for reasons that had as much to do with politics and institutional power as with theology. The Ethiopian Church's preservation of 1st Enoch is one of the reasons we have the complete text of that document. It survived in the Ethiopian tradition when it had disappeared everywhere else. We do not have the complete Book of Giants because no tradition preserved it in its entirety. Only fragments survived, but the principle is the same. What was excluded by one tradition was preserved by another, and the diversity of the ancient tradition is the best evidence we have that the canonical selection was not the only possible selection. The suppression of the Enochic literature after the establishment of the Christian canon was not merely passive, not simply a matter of official churches choosing not to use certain texts. It was, in many cases, actively and violently enforced. Gnostic traditions, Manichaean communities, Jewish apocalyptic sects, All of these groups continued to use and value the Enochic literature after it had been excluded from mainstream canonical status, and all of them were subjected to persecution by the institutional church that had excluded it. The Manichaeans, who preserved and transmitted significant portions of the Book of Giants, were among the most persistently and violently persecuted groups in the late antique world. Both the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire at various points declared Manichaeism a capital offense. Manichaean communities were massacred, their texts were burned, their leaders were executed. The degree of violence directed at a religious tradition by the dominant powers of the ancient world is itself a measure of the threat that tradition was perceived to represent. The Manichaeans preserved the Book of Giants. They were destroyed. The connection is not coincidental. Eusebius of Caesarea, the 4th century bishop who served as the official historian of the Christian Church and who was closely associated with Constantine, provides one of the clearest examples of how the management of ancient texts served institutional purposes. Eusebius was a man of genuine learning. He had access to an extraordinary library at Caesarea, one of the great repositories of ancient texts in the ancient world. And he was also a man with a clear institutional agenda to tell the history of the Christian Church in a way that legitimated its current institutional form and its alliance with the Roman Empire. In his ecclesiastical history, Eusebius makes decisions about which ancient texts and which ancient traditions to preserve, discuss, and endorse, and which to exclude or dismiss. His decisions shaped the historical record in ways that we are still living with. Texts that Eusebius cited and discussed survived in the manuscript tradition because Eusebius cited and discussed them. Texts that Eusebius ignored or dismissed tended not to survive because the copyists who maintained the manuscript tradition followed the lead of authoritative figures like Eusebius in deciding what was worth copying. The Book of Giants was not worth copying in the judgment of the institutional church, and so it nearly did not survive. The rediscovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls did not immediately or automatically overturn the institutional management of this tradition. The scrolls were discovered, as we have noted, in 1947, and the process of publication was deliberately slow and deliberately controlled. But even after publication, the institutional response was managed. The academic world, which functions, in this respect, as the secular equivalent of the church in terms of its role in determining what knowledge is legitimate, treated the Book of Giants as a curiosity, a piece of ancient Jewish literature of scholarly interest, not as something that might challenge or overturn our fundamental understanding of human history. The academic apparatus of peer review, of disciplinary boundaries, of career incentives and funding structures effectively continued the suppression that the church had begun, not through the same mechanisms of violence and censorship, but through the equally effective mechanism of marginalization, treating the text as interesting but not important, as historically significant but not practically relevant, as worthy of academic study but not of broader public engagement. The result is the same. 2,000 years after the Book of Giants was sealed in the caves of Qumran, most people on Earth have never heard of it. The ancient world's universal giant tradition. The most powerful evidence that the Book of Giants is not mythology in the dismissive sense of that word, not the invention of an imaginative culture, not the projection of psychological needs onto the cosmos, is the fact that its core tradition is not unique. It is universal. From one end of the ancient world to the other, from cultures that had no contact with each other and no access to each other's texts, from traditions separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, the same memory persists. There were once beings on this earth who were larger than ordinary human beings, more powerful, more connected to the divine realm, and whose presence was ultimately catastrophic for the world they inhabited. This universality is not explicable by cultural diffusion alone. It points to something real, to a shared memory of actual events. And the Book of Giants is the most detailed and most specific expression of that universal memory that we have. Begin with the oldest civilization in the world for which we have substantial written records, Sumer. The Sumerian tradition, which flourished in what is now southern Iraq from approximately 3500 BCE onward, provides the cultural and literary context for much of what eventually becomes the biblical tradition. The Sumerians had a concept of divine beings called the Anunnaki, a term that scholars translate as those of royal blood or those who from heaven came to earth, who were understood as the primary divine powers responsible for creating and governing the human world. The Anunnaki, in the Sumerian tradition, were not remote and abstract divine principles. They were active agents in human history, beings who descended to the earth, who interacted with human beings, who in some cases took human partners and produced offspring of unusual characteristics. The Sumerian king lists, ancient documents that record the names and reigns of Sumerian kings, include figures who are described as reigning for tens of thousands of years, figures who are clearly not ordinary human beings in the historical sense, figures whose extraordinary longevity marks them as belonging to a pre-flood order of existence that the tradition treats as genuinely historical. The Sumerian flood narrative, the oldest flood story in the written record, predating the biblical flood narrative by many centuries, tells a story that parallels the Enochic tradition in fundamental ways. A great catastrophe destroys the old world. The catastrophe is caused by the actions of the divine council, specifically by the decision of the god Enlil to destroy humanity, a decision that is opposed by the god Enki, who saves a single human being by instructing him to build a boat and survive the flood. The parallels to the biblical narrative of Noah, the divine decision to destroy, the single survivor, the boat, the flood, the aftermath, are obvious and widely acknowledged by scholars who generally understand the biblical flood narrative as drawing on or being influenced by the Mesopotamian tradition. What is less commonly acknowledged in the mainstream academic conversation is the parallel between the Sumerian tradition of the Anunnaki and the Enochic tradition of the Watchers, the parallel between the divine beings who come down from heaven and interact with human beings in ways that eventually produce catastrophic consequences, and who are ultimately judged by the divine council as a prelude to the flood. This parallel suggests that the Enochic tradition and the Mesopotamian tradition are both drawing on the same underlying historical memory, the same actual events, remembered and transmitted in different cultural languages. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the most sustained and most literary expression of this Mesopotamian tradition. Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, is described at the opening of the epic as 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal. A being of mixed divine and human nature, extraordinary in his physical capacities, possessing strength and beauty and intelligence that exceed the normal human range. He is, in the terms of the Enochic tradition, a Nephilim, the product of a divine human union, the kind of being whose existence the Watcher's transgression made possible. The Epic of Gilgamesh is, in this reading, not a story about a purely legendary figure. It is a story about an actual being of the kind that the Enochic tradition describes, a hybrid being, part divine and part human, whose existence represents the legacy of the transgression that produced the pre-flood world. The connections between the Gilgamesh epic and the Book of Giants are not superficial parallels. They are evidence of a shared tradition, a shared memory, a shared historical reality that underlies both narratives. Greece provides another extraordinarily rich parallel tradition. The Greek mythology of the Titans and the Giants, the primordial beings who preceded the Olympian gods, who were defeated in cosmic wars and imprisoned in the depths of the earth, is a clear expression of the same underlying tradition. The Titans, in the Greek tradition, are beings of enormous size and power, born of the union of Uranos, heaven, and Gaia, earth. Another version of the crossing of the boundary between the divine and the human realms that the Enochic tradition identifies as the fundamental transgression of the Watchers. The war between the Olympian gods and the Titans, the Titanomachy, is the Greek equivalent of the divine judgment described in the Enochic tradition, the destruction of the old world and its dominant beings by the new divine order, and the subsequent war between the Olympian gods and the giants. The Gigantomachy seems to describe a second eruption of the same primordial chaos, a second invasion of the ordered world by beings who belong to the old, destroyed order, but who somehow persist after it has been eliminated. This corresponds precisely to the biblical tradition's puzzling persistence of giant figures after the flood, the Nephilim of Canaan, the Rephaim of Transjordan. the giant opponents of the Israelites, beings who should not exist in the post-flood world but who do. The Norse tradition provides yet another version of the same fundamental narrative. The Jotuns, the giants of Norse mythology, are the primordial beings who existed before the Aesir gods established the current order of the world. They are beings of enormous power, connected to the forces of chaos and destruction, at permanent war with the gods who maintain the order of the cosmos. The mythology of the Norse giants is extensive and detailed, more detailed in some respects than any other ancient giant tradition except the Enochic, and it includes themes of divine giant intermarriage, of offspring of mixed divine and giant blood who play ambiguous roles in the divine narrative, of a final catastrophe, Ragnarok, in which the giants and the gods destroy each other, and the old world is ended in preparation for a new one. The structural parallels to the Enochic tradition, the primordial beings, the transgression of divine boundaries, the cosmic war, the final judgment, are striking and, given the complete independence of the Norse tradition from the Near Eastern traditions, deeply significant. The Hindu tradition of the Asura is another compelling parallel. The Asura, often translated as demons in Western scholarship, but more accurately understood as divine beings who are in opposition to the Deva, the gods of the established cosmic order, are described in the Vedic and Puranic literature as beings of enormous power who were created alongside the gods, but who chose a path of self-will and opposition rather than cosmic harmony. The Puranic literature preserves extensive accounts of the wars between the Deva and the Asura, wars in which the Asura repeatedly threaten to overthrow the established divine order and are repeatedly defeated, but never permanently destroyed. The Asura, like the giant spirits of the Enochic tradition, are persistent. They keep coming back. They keep threatening. They keep demanding a place in a world that has decided they do not belong. The thematic resonance between the Hindu tradition of the Asura and the Enochic tradition of the Nephilim spirits is one of the most fascinating in all of comparative religion. The Native American traditions, and here we must be careful because these traditions are diverse and complex, and no single generalization can do justice to all of them, also preserve extensive memories of beings who were larger than ordinary human beings and who inhabited the earth in a previous age. The traditions of the Navajo, the Cherokee, the Shawnee, the Iroquois, and many other nations include accounts of giants, beings of great size and violence who dominated the ancient world and who were ultimately destroyed by divine intervention. The Cherokee tradition, for example, preserves memories of a race of beings called the Nunehi and another group of giant beings who once inhabited the land, whose bones, the tradition says, can still be found in the earth. The Ute tradition speaks of a race of cannibalistic giants who were destroyed by the gods. The Paiute tradition, and this is particularly significant because the Paiute lived in the Great Basin region of what is now Nevada, an area that has produced some of the most intriguing archaeological evidence of unusual skeletal remains, preserves a very specific tradition of red-haired giants, beings of enormous size and violent temperament, who once inhabited their territory and who were ultimately destroyed in a great battle. We will return to the archaeological evidence in due course. For now, the point is that the giant tradition is not a Near Eastern invention. It is not a product of the specific cultural context that produced the Enochic literature. It is a universal human memory. The Aboriginal Australian tradition preserves memories of beings called the Wangina, divine or semi-divine beings who came from the sky, who interacted with human beings, and whose images are preserved in rock art of extraordinary antiquity scattered across the northwestern region of Australia. The Wangina are described as beings of great power, connected to the sky and to rain and to cosmic forces that human beings cannot control. Their images in the rock art, large, featureless faces with enormous eyes and no mouths, surrounded by halos of light or cloud, are among the most striking and most mysterious in all of ancient art. Whether the Wangina are direct parallels to the Watchers of the Enochic tradition is a matter of genuine debate, but the basic structure of the tradition, divine beings from above interacting with and affecting the human world in ways that are both powerful and ultimately problematic, is recognizable across the cultural distance. The Egyptian tradition provides some of the most fascinating parallels to the Enochic tradition in the broader ancient Near Eastern context. The concept of the Akh, the divine or spiritualized aspect of a person associated with the stars and the heavenly realm, connects to a broader Egyptian tradition of semi-divine beings and divine human hybrids that pervades Egyptian mythology and religion. The pharaoh in Egyptian theology was understood as the divine offspring of a human mother and a divine father, typically Amun-Re in the later tradition, a divine human hybrid who served as the mediator between the human and divine realms. This theological concept, the divine human hybrid as mediator and ruler, is structurally identical to the role that the Nephilim play in the Enochic tradition, though the Egyptian tradition presents it in a positive and legitimating framework rather than the catastrophic and judgmental framework of the Enochic texts. The Egyptian giants, the figures of Seth and Osiris and other divine beings who are depicted as superhuman in scale in the art and literature of ancient Egypt, also connect to this broader tradition of divine human beings in the ancient world. What all of these traditions share across their enormous cultural and geographical diversity is a fundamental narrative structure. There was an age before the current age in which beings who were more than human dominated the world. That age ended in catastrophe, flood, fire, divine war, cosmic upheaval. The beings of that previous age were destroyed or imprisoned or driven underground, and the world we now inhabit is the world that emerged from that catastrophe, a world from which those primordial beings have been removed, but whose memory persists in the traditions of every culture that has preserved the memory of the world that was. The Book of Giants is not an isolated religious text. It is the most specific, the most detailed, the most historically grounded expression of a memory that belongs to all of humanity. Understanding this universal tradition is essential to understanding why the Book of Giants matters, not only as a religious or historical document, but as a key to understanding the deep history of the human species and of the world we inhabit. The Mesopotamian connection deserves further development because it is the most direct and most textually rich parallel to the Enochic tradition, the Sumerian texts known as the Eridu Genesis, which scholars believe to be among the oldest narrative texts in the world, describe a time before the flood in which the gods lived among human beings, in which the boundary between the divine and human realms was permeable in ways it no longer is, in which the world was organized according to a set of principles different from those that govern it now. The flood in the Sumerian tradition is the event that permanently separates the divine and human worlds, that establishes the boundary between heaven and earth in its current, relatively impermeable form. Before the flood, the gods walked among human beings. After the flood, they do not. The flood is not, in this reading, simply a judgment. It is a restructuring of the cosmic order, a re-establishment of the boundaries that had been violated, a resetting of the terms on which the divine and human realms interact. This is exactly the cosmological logic of the Enochic tradition. The flood ends the world in which the Watchers violated the boundary between heaven and earth, and establishes the post-flood world in which that boundary is more strictly enforced. The Akkadian tradition that follows the Sumerian, the tradition of the great Babylonian civilization, which absorbed and transformed Sumerian culture beginning around 2300 BCE, preserves the giant tradition in its most elaborate and most literary form. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, begins with a cosmic battle between the primordial chaos goddess Tiamat and the young god Marduk, in which Marduk defeats and dismembers Tiamat, creating the ordered world from the body of the chaos being. The giant nature of Tiamat, the size, the power, the primordial force that must be overcome before order can be established, is a version of the same theme. The Anunnaki of the Babylonian tradition, preserved in explicit form in various Babylonian texts, are divine beings who descend to the earth and who, in some versions of the tradition, take human wives and produce offspring of unusual nature. The convergence between the Babylonian tradition and the Enochic tradition is not superficial. It is deep and pervasive, and it points to the existence of a shared historical memory underlying both traditions. A memory of actual events that occurred in the actual ancient world, events whose traces persist in the archaeological record and in the traditions of every civilization that has preserved its ancient literature. Enoch, Mesopotamia, and the architecture of forbidden knowledge. The figure of Enoch is one of the most enigmatic in all of biblical literature. He appears in the genealogy of Genesis 5 as the seventh patriarch from Adam, a detail that is itself significant since 7 is the number of completeness in ancient Near Eastern numerology, and he is described in two extraordinary phrases that set him apart from every other figure in that genealogy. Enoch walked with God, and God took him. Every other patriarch in Genesis 5 is described as living a certain number of years and then dying. Enoch does not die. He is taken, translated, removed from the ordinary world, transported to the divine realm in a way that preserves his existence rather than ending it. He is 365 years old when this happens, another numerologically significant detail, since 365 is the number of days in a solar year, connecting Enoch to the tradition of solar wisdom that is associated with him throughout the ancient world. The canonical Bible says nothing more about Enoch. Two phrases: he walked with God, and God took him. And then the genealogy moves on to Methuselah and Noah, and Enoch's extraordinary existence is left unexplained. But the broader tradition, the tradition represented by the Enochic literature, by the Book of Enoch, by the Book of Giants, by the various Jewish and early Christian texts that reference and elaborate the Enoch tradition, preserves a vast and detailed account of what walking with God meant, of where Enoch was taken and what he saw there, and of the role he played as a mediator between the heavenly realm and the corrupted pre-flood world. In this tradition, Enoch is not simply a righteous man who happened to have a special relationship with God. He is the most important human figure of the pre-flood world, a prophet, a scribe, a visionary who travels through the heavens in a series of extraordinary journeys, who sees the geography of the divine realm, who witnesses the judgment of the watchers, who serves as the messenger between the divine council and the giants who are condemned by its decisions. Enoch, in the Enochic tradition, is the keeper of the secret history of the world before the flood, the human figure entrusted with the knowledge of what happened and what it means. The Enoch tradition has deep roots in Mesopotamian culture, and understanding those roots helps to clarify both the historical context of the tradition and its relationship to the broader ancient Near Eastern intellectual world. In the Sumerian tradition, there is a figure called Enmeduranki, the king of the city of Sippar, who is described as the one who received the secrets of heaven and earth from the gods Shamash and Adad, the sun god and the storm god, and who was taken up to the divine assembly and shown the secrets of the heavenly realm. Enmeduranki, like Enoch, is the seventh in a line of antediluvian figures. Enmeduranki, like Enoch, has a special relationship with the divine realm that ordinary human beings do not have. Enmeduranki, like Enoch, is associated with the transmission of divine wisdom to human beings. The parallels are so close that most scholars who study the Enoch tradition acknowledge that the biblical Enoch is, at least in part, the Israelite version of the Mesopotamian Enmeduranki, the same traditional figure of the antediluvian sage who receives heavenly wisdom expressed in the cultural vocabulary of the Jewish tradition. This connection is enormously significant because it places the Enoch tradition firmly in the context of the broader Mesopotamian intellectual tradition, the tradition of Apkallu wisdom, the tradition of the seven sages who are said in Mesopotamian tradition to have brought the foundations of civilization to human beings before the flood. The Apkallu, the Babylonian term for these antediluvian sages, are described in Mesopotamian sources as beings who were sent by the god Ea to teach human beings the arts of civilization: agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, law. They are half fish and half human in some representations, suggesting a boundary-crossing nature, beings who belong to both the watery depths of the cosmic ocean and the human world above it. In other representations, they are shown as fully human figures with eagle wings, suggesting a connection to the heavenly realm above. The Apkallu are, in the terms of the Enochic tradition, a version of the Watchers, beings of mixed divine and human or semi-divine nature, associated with the transmission of divine wisdom to the human world, whose legacy is both foundational to civilization and ultimately problematic. The connection between Enoch and the Apkallu tradition suggests that the Enochic tradition is not simply a Jewish theological invention. It is a Jewish expression of a much older and much broader Mesopotamian tradition about the origins of human civilization, a tradition that preserves the memory of a time before the flood when divine beings interacted directly with human beings, transmitting knowledge and skills that transformed the human world. The Jewish tradition identified the transmission of this knowledge as a transgression, as something that should not have happened, that violated the boundary between the divine and human realms, that ultimately required the catastrophic intervention of the flood to correct. The Mesopotamian tradition was more ambiguous. The Apkallu were generally regarded as benefactors, as the founders of civilization, as the source of the wisdom that made human cultural achievement possible. But even in the Mesopotamian tradition, there is an underlying tension, a sense that the relationship between the divine sages and the human world was complicated, that the knowledge they brought was both gift and burden, that the civilization they made possible was magnificent but ultimately fragile. Enoch's role in the Book of Giants is, as we have seen, that of the mediator, the figure who stands between the condemned giants and the divine council, who carries the messages of the heavenly realm to the beings who are about to be destroyed. This role is itself a form of cosmic knowledge. Enoch knows things that neither the giants nor the ordinary human world can know, because he has been taken up to the divine realm and been granted access to the cosmic council where the decisions of the universe are made. The knowledge Enoch possesses is qualitatively different from the knowledge that the Watchers transmitted to human beings. Azazel's metallurgy, Shemahaza's enchantments, the other Watchers' astronomical and earthly secrets. Those were technical skills, forms of practical knowledge that could be applied to human purposes, for better or for worse. Enoch's knowledge is cosmic, an understanding of the structure of reality, of the nature of the divine, of the logic of judgment and justice that governs the universe. This is the knowledge that the Book of Giants preserves, not merely the story of the giants, but the cosmological framework that makes that story intelligible. The cosmological framework of the Enochic tradition is one of the most sophisticated in all of ancient religious thought. It describes a universe structured in multiple levels: the earth, the heavenly realms above it, the abyssal realms below, inhabited by a complex population of beings of different natures and different relationships to the divine source of all reality. The Watchers are members of the Divine Council, high-ranking members of the Heavenly Court, who choose to violate the order of their station by descending to the human realm and taking human wives. The giants are the product of that violation, beings who exist in the gap between the divine and human realms, belonging fully to neither, capable of things that ordinary human beings cannot do, but subject to judgment in ways that the Watchers, as members of the divine court, might hope to avoid. The archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, are the executors of divine justice, the beings through whom the decisions of the cosmic council are implemented in the physical world. Enoch is the unique human figure who has access to the cosmic council, who can observe the workings of this complex system, and who is tasked with communicating its decisions to the world below. What is striking about this cosmological framework? What makes it so significant and so threatening to the institutional traditions that excluded it is its specificity and its coherence. This is not a vague or impressionistic religious vision. This is a detailed and internally consistent account of the structure of reality, of the kinds of beings that inhabit different levels of that structure, and of the rules and relationships that govern their interactions. It is, in the best sense of the word, a cosmology, an ordered understanding of the cosmos that can generate specific and testable predictions about how the universe works and how its various parts relate to each other. The Enochic cosmology is not identical with modern scientific cosmology, obviously, but it is not simply primitive superstition either. It is a serious intellectual attempt to understand the nature of reality, and its exclusion from the mainstream tradition has impoverished that tradition in ways that are still being felt. The traditions of knowledge that the Watchers transmitted to human beings deserve more careful attention than they typically receive, because they may tell us something important about the actual history of human technological and cultural development. Azazel, in the Book of Enoch, teaches the making of swords and shields, metallurgy in its military application. He teaches the working of metals more broadly, which in the ancient world encompassed not just weapons, but tools, agricultural implements, architectural elements, all of the metal-based technology that underpins complex civilization. He teaches the making of bracelets and ornaments, the use of antimony, the beautifying of the eyelids, the arts of cosmetics and personal ornamentation that, trivial as they may sound, are deeply connected in the ancient world to the development of symbolic culture, to the human capacity to construct identities and social relationships through material means. Other watchers teach the cutting of roots and the knowledge of plants, what we would now call pharmacology and herbalism, the applied knowledge of the natural world. Others teach astrology and the reading of the heavenly signs, the systematic observation of the sky that is the foundation of both the calendar and the more complex astronomical traditions of the ancient world. This list of transmitted knowledge is, in effect, a list of the foundational technologies and intellectual disciplines that define early human civilization. It is not a coincidence that these are precisely the things that appear in the archaeological record, with a suddenness and sophistication that puzzles researchers who try to explain them through purely incremental models of human development. The appearance of metallurgy in the archaeological record is one of the most dramatic examples of this kind of sudden technological emergence. The earliest evidence of smelting, the production of metals from ores through the application of high heat, dates to around 7000 BCE in the ancient Near East, but the development from early smelting to sophisticated metalworking, to the production of bronze and then iron, to the full metallurgical tradition that characterizes the great ancient civilizations, this development occurs with a speed and a completeness that has always struck archaeologists as remarkable. The Enochic tradition's suggestion that this knowledge was not developed organically through purely human innovation, but was transmitted from a non-human source, is, at minimum, a hypothesis that deserves serious consideration in the light of the archaeological evidence. The astronomical traditions of the ancient world present an even more striking case for the hypothesis of non-human transmission. The precision of ancient astronomical knowledge, the accuracy of Babylonian and Egyptian and Mayan astronomical records, the sophistication of megalithic astronomical alignments like Stonehenge and Newgrange and Göbekli Tepe, the extraordinary mathematical precision of ancient calendrical systems, is difficult to explain on the basis of what we would expect from purely human observation over relatively short periods of time. The Babylonian astronomical tradition, in particular, demonstrates a level of precision in its observations and calculations that requires, on the standard model of gradual human development, many centuries of careful, systematic observation. But the tradition appears, in the historical record, already highly developed, already possessing a level of sophistication that ought to require much more developmental time than the archaeological record allows. The Enochic tradition's suggestion that astronomical knowledge was a divine gift transmitted to human beings by the Watchers, specifically by the Watcher described as teaching the reading of the heavenly signs, offers an alternative explanation for this apparent anomaly. The Book of Enoch's geography of the heavenly realm, the detailed accounts of Enoch's journeys through the heavens, the descriptions of the storehouses of wind and rain and snow, the geography of the rivers of fire, the description of the place of judgment prepared for the Watchers, is itself a form of cosmological knowledge of extraordinary interest. Modern scholars of ancient religion have noted that the heavenly geography described in the Book of Enoch shows a remarkable consistency with the heavenly geography described in other ancient texts, in the Mesopotamian tradition, in the early Kabbalistic literature, in certain Gnostic texts, suggesting that what we are dealing with is not a single author's imaginative invention, but a traditional body of knowledge about the structure of the heavenly realm that was preserved and transmitted across different cultural contexts. Whether this traditional body of knowledge represents genuine mystical insight, genuine visionary experience, or the preservation of some other kind of information about the nature of reality, is a question that the modern world is poorly equipped to answer. But it is a question worth asking. The figure of Enoch himself, the human being who walks with God, who is taken up to the divine realm, who serves as mediator and messenger between heaven and earth, is in many respects the most important figure in the entire tradition. He represents a possibility that the mainstream religious traditions have systematically denied: the possibility of genuine human access to the cosmic level of reality, of human beings receiving direct and accurate information about the nature of the universe and the forces that govern it. The institutional church's exclusion of the Enochic literature is, in this sense, also an exclusion of the tradition of direct human access to divine wisdom, a decision that the mediation of divine truth must occur through institutional channels, through the authorized clergy, through the official sacramental structures of the established church, rather than through the kind of direct cosmic experience that the Enoch tradition describes. The exclusion of the Book of Giants is an exclusion of the most dramatic expression of this tradition, a text in which the human prophet not only receives heavenly wisdom, but exercises it as a mediator of divine judgment, a figure whose word carries the authority of the cosmic council itself. This is too powerful a tradition to allow to exist within the institutional framework of a managed religion, and so it was removed. The physical evidence, bones, buildings, and the archaeology of giants. We have been in the realm of texts for much of this investigation. Fragments of ancient manuscripts, traditions preserved across cultures, the literary and theological evidence for the reality of the beings described in the Book of Giants. Now we need to enter a different realm, the realm of physical evidence, the bones, the structures, the archaeological discoveries that either confirm or challenge the textual tradition. This is where the conversation becomes most contentious, most emotionally charged, and most important. Because the physical evidence, what has been found in the earth, what the rocks and the bones and the ancient ruins actually tell us, is both more extensive and more systematically suppressed than most people realize. Let us begin with the most basic question: what would we expect to find if the tradition of the Book of Giants is historically accurate? If the earth was once inhabited by beings significantly larger than ordinary human beings, beings descended from divine entities, and therefore possessing unusual physical characteristics, what traces would they leave in the archaeological record? The answer is large bones, large structures, and potentially unusual genetic or anatomical characteristics in the skeletal remains. All three categories of evidence have been claimed, at various times and in various contexts, by researchers who have taken the physical evidence seriously, and all three categories have been met by the mainstream academic and scientific establishment with a degree of dismissal that is itself revealing. The most directly relevant category of physical evidence is skeletal remains, actual bones of ancient human or near-human individuals that show unusual size. Reports of anomalously large ancient human skeletal remains exist in the historical and archaeological literature from virtually every part of the world. 19th century American archaeology, in particular, produced an extraordinary number of reports of giant human skeletons, remains of individuals ranging from 7 to 9 feet in height, and in some cases even larger, recovered from burial mounds across the eastern United States. The Smithsonian Institution, which was the primary repository of Native American archaeological materials in the 19th and early 20th centuries, received reports of, and in some cases, physical custody of many of these unusual remains. The fate of those remains, what was done with them, where they are now, why they have not been made available for systematic scientific study, is one of the most disturbing questions in the entire field of American archaeology. The reports of giant skeletal remains from 19th century American archaeology are extensive and remarkably consistent. Newspapers from Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Tennessee, and dozens of other states published accounts of mound excavations that produced skeletal remains of individuals significantly larger than ordinary human beings. Many of these accounts were published in sources that were considered reliable at the time: local newspapers, state historical society publications, accounts by credentialed archaeologists and surveyors. They describe skeletons of 7, 8, even 9 feet in height, with bones proportionally heavier and denser than normal human remains, often found in association with artifacts of unusual size or unusual workmanship. These are not tabloid accounts or obvious fabrications. They are, in many cases, sober and careful descriptions by individuals who had every reason to describe what they found accurately. What happened to the bones they found is a question that demands an answer. The Smithsonian Institution has been at the center of this controversy for over a century. Critics have argued that the Smithsonian received many of the anomalous skeletal remains reported in the 19th century, that it subjected them to analysis that confirmed their unusual size and characteristics, and that it then either destroyed those remains, classified information about them, or quietly removed them from public access. This is a serious charge, and it is a charge that the Smithsonian has consistently denied. What the institution cannot deny is that the 19th century archaeological record is full of reports of anomalous skeletal remains that have no corresponding physical specimens in any publicly accessible collection. The remains were reported. They were in some cases received by institutions like the Smithsonian, and then they disappeared. The explanation that they were simply lost in the normal processes of institutional management, that records were imperfect in the 19th century, that archaeological collections were not always carefully maintained, that the disappearance of thousands of reported skeletal specimens reflects nothing more than the ordinary losses of institutional record-keeping, strains credulity in the face of the scale and consistency of the disappearances. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, passed by the United States Congress in 1990, has been used in ways that have further complicated the study of anomalous ancient remains. NAGPRA requires that Native American human remains held in federal institutions be returned to affiliated tribal groups, which is a legitimate and important protection of indigenous cultural heritage. But NAGPRA has also been applied in cases where the human remains in question are so ancient, predating any identifiable Native American cultural group by many thousands of years, that the affiliated tribe designation is essentially arbitrary. The case of Kennewick Man, the approximately 9,000-year-old skeletal remains found in Washington state in 1996, illustrated this dynamic vividly. Kennewick Man's remains showed anatomical characteristics that were not consistent with modern Native American populations, suggesting that the ancient inhabitants of the Americas may have been more diverse and more complex than the standard archaeological narrative allows. A lengthy legal battle over the remains, between scientists who wanted to study them and Native American tribes who claimed cultural affiliation with them, ended in 2017, when Kennewick Man's remains were repatriated and buried, effectively ending the scientific analysis of a specimen that might have provided important information about the deep human past. The case of Kennewick Man is instructive for several reasons. First, it demonstrates that the scientific study of anomalous ancient human remains is subject to political and institutional pressures that have nothing to do with the scientific merit of the research. Second, it demonstrates that important scientific information about the human past can be effectively suppressed not through direct censorship, but through the application of cultural and legal frameworks that prevent access to the physical evidence. Third, and most directly relevant to our investigation, it raises the question of what other anomalous remains might exist, or might have existed, that have been similarly removed from scientific study through one mechanism or another. The academic establishment's consistent dismissal of reports of giant skeletal remains is difficult to evaluate fairly in a situation where the physical evidence has been systematically made unavailable. You cannot definitively disprove the existence of something that you have systematically prevented from being studied. The most famous case of anomalous skeletal remains in recent years is perhaps the research conducted by L.A. Marzulli, Steve Quayle, and others into the elongated skulls found at Paracas, Peru. The Paracas Peninsula on the southern coast of Peru has produced some of the most extraordinary ancient human remains ever recovered. Skulls with cranial volumes significantly larger than normal human skulls, elongated in a direction and to a degree that goes far beyond what can be produced by the practice of cranial binding that was widespread in ancient Andean cultures. The Paracas skulls have been the subject of limited formal scientific analysis, but the results of that limited analysis have been, to say the least, surprising. The parietal plates, the bones at the top and sides of the skull, appear in the Paracas skulls to be structured differently from normal human skulls, with a single parietal plate rather than the normal two. This morphological difference is not consistent with cranial deformation by binding. It is consistent with a genuinely different anatomical structure, with a cranial formation that belongs to a different biological type than ordinary modern humans. DNA analysis of some of the Paracas skull tissue has produced results that have been described as puzzling by those who conducted the analysis. The mitochondrial DNA of some of the tested specimens shows haplogroups that do not correspond to any known Native American, South American, European, or Asian populations. The results, if accurate, would suggest that the individuals whose skulls were tested belong to a biological lineage that is not represented in any modern human population. A lineage that is, in the specific sense of that term, unknown to modern genetic science. This is an extraordinary claim, and it must be treated with appropriate caution. The analysis has not been published in a peer-reviewed journal. The methodology has not been subjected to the kind of independent verification that would be required before drawing firm scientific conclusions. The possibility of contamination or laboratory error cannot be ruled out without further testing, but the possibility that the results, if confirmed, would represent exactly the kind of physical evidence that the tradition of the Book of Giants would predict, remains of beings with genuinely different biological characteristics, representing a lineage distinct from ordinary human beings, is something that deserves serious investigation rather than reflexive dismissal. The megalithic structures of the ancient world present a different category of physical evidence, not bones, but buildings, or rather structures of a scale and precision that raises urgent questions about who built them and how. The Great Pyramid of Giza remains, after decades of intensive archaeological and engineering study, fundamentally mysterious in its method of construction. The precision of its alignment, within a fraction of a degree to true north, exceeds the capabilities of most modern surveying instruments. The accuracy of its geometry, the degree to which the four sides are equal, the corners are square, the faces are at precisely the intended angle, is extraordinary for any period of human technological development, let alone the 3rd millennium BCE. The weight of the individual blocks, ranging from several tons to over 80 tons for the granite blocks in the King's Chamber, raises serious questions about the logistics of their movement and placement that have never been fully satisfactorily answered by conventional archaeological explanations. The Great Pyramid is not the only such structure. The temples of Baalbek in Lebanon, with their trilithon blocks weighing over 1,000 tons, the largest cut stone blocks in the world, represent a construction achievement that challenges explanation. Puma Punku in Bolivia, with its precisely interlocking stone blocks showing machined surfaces and right-angle precision that seems impossible to achieve with Stone Age technology, is another. Sacsayhuaman in Peru, with its massive polygonal blocks fitted together without mortar to tolerances of a fraction of an inch. Stonehenge in Britain, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Göbekli Tepe deserves special attention because it has fundamentally disrupted the conventional archaeological narrative about the development of human civilization. Discovered in 1994 and dated to approximately 9600 BCE, over 11,000 years ago, Göbekli Tepe consists of massive circular enclosures built of precisely shaped T-shaped limestone pillars, many of them decorated with sophisticated relief carvings of animals and abstract symbols. It predates the invention of agriculture, the development of writing, the emergence of the earliest known cities. By the conventional archaeological narrative, the people who built Göbekli Tepe, hunter-gatherers living in small mobile bands, should not have had the social organization, the sustained communal effort, or the technical knowledge to construct anything of this kind, and yet they did. Göbekli Tepe is not a small or simple structure. It is enormous. The excavated portions represent only a small fraction of the total site, which extends over approximately 90,000 square meters. It required sustained communal effort over an extended period. It required knowledge of architectural principles, of stoneworking techniques, of astronomical alignment that the standard model of human cultural development at this period does not allow for. Whatever built Göbekli Tepe was not operating within the limits that the standard archaeological narrative assigns to early human populations. The connection between the megalithic tradition and the tradition of the Book of Giants has been proposed by a number of researchers who have taken both bodies of evidence seriously. The suggestion is that the construction of these extraordinary ancient structures that challenge or exceed the apparent capabilities of the human populations that conventionally built them, is part of the physical legacy of the pre-flood world that the Enochic tradition describes. The knowledge that the Watchers transmitted, the knowledge of building, of engineering, of astronomical alignment, of the working of large stones, is the knowledge that made these structures possible, and the beings who most directly applied that knowledge, who had both the knowledge and the physical capacity to work at the scales required, were the giants themselves. This is a hypothesis, not a proven fact, but it is a hypothesis that fits the available evidence better than any alternative that the mainstream archaeological tradition has produced. No one has produced a satisfactory explanation within the framework of standard human cultural development for how hunter-gatherers built Göbekli Tepe, or how early dynastic Egyptians built the Great Pyramid, or how the pre-Incan peoples of South America built the structures at Pumapunku and Sacsayhuaman. The tradition of the Book of Giants and the Enochic literature does produce an explanation, and that explanation is worth taking seriously. The genetics of the ancient world is another domain of physical evidence that is beginning to produce results that challenge the standard narrative of human origins. Ancient DNA research, the analysis of genetic material extracted from ancient skeletal remains, has, in the past decade, transformed our understanding of the human past in ways that were not anticipated by the conventional archaeological narrative. We now know that the human population of ancient Europe was far more complex and far more diverse than previously believed, that there were multiple waves of migration, multiple population replacements, multiple instances of ancient populations being almost entirely replaced by incoming groups with different genetic profiles. We know that the Denisovans, a species or subspecies of ancient humans known almost entirely from a few bone fragments found in a cave in Siberia, had a geographic distribution extending across much of southern Asia and into the Pacific, and that their genes are present in the genomes of modern populations from Papua New Guinea to Tibet. We know that Homo sapiens interbred not only with Neanderthals and Denisovans, but with other, as yet unidentified, archaic human populations that have left genetic signatures in the modern genome, but have not yet been identified in the fossil record. The human past is far more complex, far more diverse, far more populated with distinct biological lineages than the textbook story of human evolution allows. In the context of this increasingly complex picture of ancient human diversity, the tradition of the Book of Giants and the Enochic literature, with its account of beings who were biological hybrids, who carried divine and human genetics in combination, who were distinctly different from ordinary human beings in their physical characteristics and capacities, becomes less obviously impossible and more obviously worth investigating. The ancient genome is full of signals from populations that are not yet fully characterized. Some of those uncharacterized populations may represent lineages that the ancient tradition recorded in the only language available to it, the language of divine parentage, of heavenly descent, of beings who were sons of the gods, in a world where what we would now call genetics was expressed as theology, the possibility that what the Book of Giants describes as the biological offspring of divine beings and human women corresponds to what modern genetics would describe as a hybridization between anatomically modern humans and some other biological lineage, a lineage whose characteristics included unusual size, unusual longevity, unusual cognitive or physical capacity, is not, in the light of what we now know about ancient human diversity, as outlandish as it might once have seemed. The flood as cosmic surgery, divine judgment, and the end of the giant age. The flood is the climax of the story. It is the event toward which the entire narrative of the Book of Giants, the Enochic tradition, and the canonical Genesis account all point. the catastrophic divine intervention that ends the old world and makes the new one possible. But the flood, as it has been understood within the mainstream religious tradition, has been fundamentally misrepresented in ways that the Book of Giants corrects. The mainstream tradition presents the flood as a judgment on human sinfulness, a story about what happens when people choose evil, when moral corruption reaches a tipping point, when God's patience with human wickedness finally runs out. This reading is not entirely wrong, but it is profoundly incomplete, because the flood is not primarily a judgment on ordinary human sinfulness. It is the final solution to a specific and unprecedented crisis. The crisis created by the Watcher's transgression and the giants' resulting domination and destruction of the pre-flood world. Understanding the flood in this context, understanding it as what it actually was, a deliberate and targeted divine intervention designed to eliminate a specific biological and spiritual threat, changes everything about how we read both the flood narrative and the history of the world that followed it. The Book of Enoch is explicit about this. The archangels, surveying the devastation that the giants have brought upon the earth, cry out to God with a complaint that is, in its way, one of the most poignant things in all of ancient literature. The earth, deprived of her children, has cried to the gate of heaven, and now to you, the holy ones of heaven, the souls of men make their suit, saying, "Bring our cause before the Most High." The earth itself is suffering. The human population is being devoured by the giants. The created order that was established at the beginning of the world has been corrupted to the point of collapse. And God's response to the archangel's complaint is to set in motion the chain of events that will end the world of the giants and make a new beginning possible, binding the Watchers, destroying the giants in the great flood, preserving Noah and his family as the seed of the new world, and establishing a new covenant that will govern the post-flood relationship between the divine and human realms. The selection of Noah as the survivor is itself theologically significant in ways that the canonical tradition preserves but does not fully explain. Genesis tells us that Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation, and that Noah walked with God. These phrases parallel exactly the description of Enoch. Enoch walked with God, suggesting that the two figures are connected in the tradition's understanding that both represent the ideal of genuine human righteousness in a world corrupted by the influence of the Watchers and the giants. But the tradition also preserves a more specific and more biological reason for Noah's selection. The Book of Enoch includes a passage, not in the surviving Qumran Aramaic, but in the Ethiopic version, that describes how Noah's father, Lamech, was terrified by Noah's appearance at birth, because the infant was born with white hair and eyes like the sun, and Lamech feared that the child was the offspring of a watcher rather than his own son. Lamech consults his father Methuselah, who in turn consults Enoch, who assures Lamech that Noah is indeed his own son, and that his unusual appearance marks him not as the child of an angelic father, but as a special human being set apart for a divine purpose. This passage, the birth of Noah and the terror his appearance inspires, is one of the most extraordinary in the entire Enochic tradition, and it is entirely absent from the canonical Genesis narrative. It suggests that the boundary between the ordinary human world and the world of the giants was not absolute or impermeable, that the mixing of genetic material that resulted from the Watchers taking human wives had spread into the human population in ways that were not always obvious, ways that could surface unexpectedly in the appearance and characteristics of individual children. It suggests, in other words, that the pre-flood world was genetically complex in ways that the canonical tradition does not acknowledge, that ordinary human populations in the pre-flood world may have carried genetic material inherited from the Watchers' descendants without being giants in the full sense of that term. And it suggests that the selection of Noah as the survivor of the flood was, at least in part, a genetic selection, a choice of a human being whose bloodline was, despite its apparent anomalies, genuinely human rather than hybrid in its fundamental nature. The mechanics of the flood itself, as described in the Enochic tradition, are more complex than the simple rain for 40 days and 40 nights of the Genesis account. The Book of Enoch describes the flood as a cosmic event, an unleashing of the waters of the great deep, a reversal of the creative ordering of the waters that took place at the beginning of the world. In Genesis 1, God separates the waters above from the waters below, establishing the firmament that holds the sky in place and the earth above the primordial deep. The flood, in the Enochic cosmological understanding, is a partial reversal of this separation. The waters that were separated at creation are allowed to reunite, temporarily, as an expression of the divine decision that the order established at creation has been so thoroughly violated that it must be dissolved and rebuilt. The flood is not simply a natural disaster, it is a cosmological event, a moment of creative destruction in which the world is returned to a state of primordial chaos so that a new order can be established on better foundations. The tradition preserved in the Book of Giants about the giants' response to the approaching flood is fragmentary but suggestive. The dreams of Oya and Mahwe, as we have seen, were premonitions of the coming destruction, cosmic visions delivered in the language of the heavenly realm, informing the giants that their world was ending. The text suggests that the giants' response to these premonitions was a combination of terror and defiance. They knew the flood was coming. They could not stop it, but they fought against their fate in every way available to them. This resistance is entirely absent from the canonical tradition, which presents the pre-flood world as simply passive in the face of the divine decision to destroy it. The Book of Giants gives the condemned a voice and an agency. They are not simply swept away without awareness or response. They know, they fight, they lose. And the cosmic drama of their resistance and their defeat is one of the most powerful things the Book of Giants contains, and one of the clearest reasons why it needed to be excluded from a tradition that required the moral clarity of simple divine justice. The question of what survived the flood, not just Noah and his family, but potentially other lineages, other traditions, other biological and cultural legacies of the pre-flood world, is one of the most contested in the entire field of ancient history. The canonical tradition insists on the totality of the flood's destruction. Everything perished except what was on the ark. But even the canonical tradition, as we have noted, contains puzzling references to the post-flood existence of giant peoples, the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Nephilim of Canaan, that are not explicable within the framework of total destruction, and the broader tradition, including the ancient mythological traditions of many cultures, preserves more specific accounts of beings or bloodlines that survived the flood in various ways. The Sumerian tradition describes how certain forms of divine wisdom, specifically the knowledge of the Apkallu, were preserved through the flood and transmitted into the post-flood world. The Egyptian tradition describes a similar process, the preservation of ancient wisdom through the catastrophe of the flood in the form of inscriptions on pillars or sacred tablets that survived the waters. Even the biblical tradition preserves in the mysterious figure of Melchizedek, the king of Salem who meets Abraham and blesses him, a figure without genealogy, without origin, without predecessor or successor, who appears from nowhere and disappears again. The memory of a pre-flood tradition that survived into the post-flood world in some form. The Book of Giants, in its fragmentary state, does not fully answer the question of what survived the flood, but it raises it in a way that demands engagement. The dream vision of 2/3 of the giant names washed away and 1/3 remaining is the most direct suggestion that partial survival was part of the tradition's understanding of the flood's consequences, and the persistence of giant figures in the post-flood biblical narrative. Figures who are explicitly identified as descendants or remnants of the pre-flood Nephilim confirms that the tradition, at some level, understood the flood as incomplete in its elimination of the giant lineages. The post-flood world is not the clean slate that the canonical narrative implies. It is a world still haunted by the legacy of the pre-flood world. Genetically, culturally, spiritually, the giant bloodlines that the flood was supposed to destroy have not been completely destroyed. They have been diminished, scattered, driven underground, but they persist. The spiritual legacy of the flood is addressed most directly in the section of the Book of Enoch that follows the flood narrative. The account of how the spirits of the giants, their physical bodies destroyed, continue to wander the post-flood world as evil spirits seeking to corrupt and destroy human beings. This tradition, that the destruction of the giants' bodies in the flood created rather than ended a particular spiritual threat to humanity, is one of the most significant and most disturbing in the entire Enochic corpus. It suggests that the flood solved one problem while creating another. It eliminated the physical giants, but it released their spirits into the world in an unbound and ungoverned form. The evil spirits of the Enochic tradition, what the New Testament calls demons, what the broader religious tradition across cultures calls malevolent, non-human spiritual entities, are the spiritual legacy of the giants. And their existence in the post-flood world is, in the Enochic understanding, one of the primary sources of the ongoing spiritual and moral crisis of human history. This understanding of the post-flood world, as a world still inhabited by the spiritual remnants of the pre-flood corruption, is the background against which the entire tradition of spiritual warfare, demonic possession, and the necessity of divine protection must be understood. The New Testament's pervasive assumption that the world is populated by malevolent spiritual forces, the demons that Jesus casts out, the principalities and powers that Paul describes as the true enemies of human flourishing, the beast and the dragon of the Revelation, makes complete sense only within the Enochic cosmological framework. Without that framework, the New Testament's demonology is mysterious and poorly grounded. With it, it is the natural continuation of a tradition that extends from the pre-flood world through the flood and into the present. A tradition that insists that the problem created by the Watcher's transgression was not fully solved by the flood, that the crisis of the pre-flood world has a continuing resonance in the spiritual ecology of the post-flood world, and that human beings navigating this world are navigating a reality that includes non-human malevolent forces whose origins go back to the Book of Giants. The flood marks the end of the giant age and the beginning of the current age of human history, but it does not mark the end of the giant tradition. The physical remnants of the giant civilization, if the hypothesis of physical giants in the pre-flood world is correct, would include precisely the kinds of evidence we have been discussing: anomalous skeletal remains, megalithic structures built at a scale and precision exceeding apparent human capabilities, astronomical alignments, and mathematical systems of extraordinary sophistication. The spiritual remnants of the giant civilization, according to the Enochic tradition, include the disembodied spirits that continue to inhabit and trouble the human world. And the cultural remnants of the giant civilization include the memory of the pre-flood world itself, the memory preserved in the traditions of every ancient culture, the memory that the Book of Giants was written to preserve, and that the mainstream tradition worked so hard to eliminate. The flood was supposed to end the giant age. The Book of Giants ensures that the giant age is not forgotten. The early church and its giant problem. The early Christian movement did not begin with the Book of Giants excluded and forgotten. In the first century of the Common Era, in the world of the apostles, of the earliest communities of Jesus' followers scattered across the Mediterranean basin, of Paul writing his letters to the congregations at Corinth and Rome, and Ephesus and Galatia, the Enochic tradition was very much alive and very much present in the theological thinking of the new movement. The Epistle of Jude, which is canonical in every Christian tradition, quotes directly from the Book of Enoch, directly, explicitly, without apology or qualification, as if quoting from Scripture, because for Jude and for the community to which he wrote, the Book of Enoch was Scripture. The Epistle of 1 Peter references the imprisonment of the spirits who disobeyed in the days of Noah, a clear reference to the Watchers of the Enochic tradition. The Epistle of 2 Peter elaborates the same tradition, specifically connecting the imprisoned angels who sinned with the flood and the subsequent destruction of the ungodly world. The author of the Apocalypse of John, which we call the Revelation, fills his prophetic vision with imagery drawn from the Enochic tradition: the dragon, the abyss, the chains of imprisoned spiritual beings, the cosmic war between divine and adversarial forces. The Enochic tradition did not need to be introduced into early Christian thinking. It was already there. It was the water in which the earliest Christianity swam. What happened to that tradition how it went from being the assumed background of apostolic theology to being a suppressed and marginalized body of literature within 2 centuries, is one of the most important and least discussed stories in the history of Christianity. The story involves the gradual triumph of what scholars call proto-orthodoxy over the theological diversity of the early movement, the process by which one particular theological stream, associated with specific bishops in specific major cities, won out over the many competing theological visions that characterized the early church, and imposed its vision not only on the theological content of Christianity, but on the literary canon that was to carry that content forward. The proto-Orthodox tradition, the tradition associated with figures like Ignatius of Antioch, Irenaeus of Lyon, Tertullian of Carthage, was suspicious of the Enochic tradition from an early date, and its suspicion was both theological and political. Theologically, the Enochic tradition's complex cosmology, its populated heavenly realm, its fallen divine beings, its hybrid offspring, its spiritual complexity, was difficult to reconcile with the theological simplicity that the proto-Orthodox tradition preferred. Politically, the Enochic tradition was associated with groups, Gnostic communities, apocalyptic sects, Jewish Christian communities, that the proto-Orthodox tradition identified as its enemies in the struggle to define the boundary of authentic Christianity. The Gnostic traditions, the diverse and richly textured theological movements that competed with proto-Orthodoxy in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, were deeply indebted to the Enochic tradition. The Gnostic cosmologies, with their multiple divine beings arranged in hierarchies of greater and lesser goodness, with their fallen divine powers who created the material world, with their understanding of matter as a realm of darkness and spirit as a realm of light. All of this is deeply shaped by the Enochic tradition's picture of divine beings who chose transgression and whose transgression had cosmic consequences. The Gnostic figure of the demiurge, the lesser divine being who created the material world, often identified with the God of the Hebrew Bible, can be understood as a theological elaboration of the Watcher tradition, a divine being who acts within the material world in ways that violate the true cosmic order, who creates rather than destroys, but whose creation is itself a form of transgression against the higher reality. The Gnostic understanding of matter as inherently corrupt, of the material body as a prison for the divine spark of the human spirit, resonates with the Enochic tradition's picture of the giants, beings whose divine spiritual element is trapped within a corrupted physical form, beings whose nature is defined by the impossibly difficult combination of heavenly origin and earthly embodiment. The proto-Orthodox tradition attacked Gnosticism with ferocity precisely because the Gnostic cosmological vision was so compelling, so richly elaborated, so capable of making sense of the human experience of suffering and alienation. Irenaeus's massive work against heresies, the most systematic early refutation of Gnostic theology, is essentially a sustained argument against the cosmological complexity that the Enochic tradition introduces and that the Gnostics develop. Irenaeus's theology insists on the simplicity of the divine: one God, one creation, one covenant, one redemption. The complex, populated, morally ambiguous cosmos of the Enochic tradition, with its watchers and giants and evil spirits and cosmic negotiations, is precisely what Irenaeus cannot allow. It makes the story too complicated. It makes the divine too ambiguous. It makes the world too full of non-human agency and non-human history, and it opens the door to exactly the kind of theological speculation that the proto-Orthodox tradition needed to close. Tertullian, writing in North Africa in the late 2nd and early 3rd century, is one of the few early church fathers who engages with the Book of Enoch directly and who acknowledges its authority. Tertullian argues for the canonical status of one Enoch on the grounds that Jude's canonical epistle quotes from it. If Jude is scripture and Jude cites Enoch, then Enoch must also be scripture. This is a straightforward logical argument, and it is an argument that Tertullian seems to have genuinely believed. But Tertullian's voice was not the dominant voice in the Western Church, and the tradition he argued for did not prevail. What prevailed was the tradition of Irenaeus and subsequently of Augustine, the tradition that insisted on limiting the scope of recognized revelation, on establishing clear and defensible boundaries around what was and was not to be considered authoritative, on managing the cosmological complexity of the Enochic tradition out of existence. Augustine's intervention is particularly decisive and particularly revealing. In The City of God, written in the early 5th century in the aftermath of the sack of Rome by the Visigoths, Augustine produces the most comprehensive and most influential synthesis of Christian theology written in the ancient world. And in that synthesis, Augustine makes a series of decisions about the Enochic tradition that effectively close the question for the Western Church for over a millennium. Augustine acknowledges the tradition of the fallen angels and the Nephilim. He knows about the Book of Enoch, but he argues, on theological grounds, that the sons of God of Genesis 6 must be understood as the righteous descendants of Seth rather than as divine beings, because divine beings, angels, do not have physical bodies and therefore cannot engage in physical reproduction. This argument is designed to make the Enochic tradition impossible. If the sons of God are human, then there are no watchers, there are no giants in the hybrid sense, there is no pre-flood cosmic catastrophe of the kind the Enochic tradition describes. There is only a story about human sinfulness and divine judgment, a story that fits the Augustinian theological framework without complicating it. The problem with Augustine's argument is that it directly contradicts the text it purports to explain. The phrase Bene ha Elohim, sons of the divine beings, in Genesis 6 means divine beings, not human beings. It means exactly what it says. The Septuagint translators, working centuries before Augustine, understood it that way and translated it with a Greek phrase that equally clearly means divine beings. The Jewish tradition, in its various expressions before the rabbinic period's growing discomfort with the tradition, understood it that way. The Epistle of Jude, which is canonical, understood it that way. The entire Enochic tradition understood it that way. Augustine's reinterpretation is not a correction of a misunderstanding. It is a deliberate theological decision to force the text to mean something other than what it says in order to protect a theological framework that cannot accommodate what it actually means. And because Augustine's authority in the Western Church was enormous, his decision stuck. The Western Christian tradition has been living with Augustine's reinterpretation for 1600 years. The Book of Giants is, among other things, the most powerful possible refutation of that reinterpretation, a text that gives specific names, specific narratives, specific details about the beings who were the sons of the divine beings in Genesis 6. A text that makes Augustine's domestication of the tradition simply untenable to anyone willing to engage with it honestly. The Eastern Church's tradition is somewhat different. The Eastern Churches, the Greek Orthodox, the Coptic, the Syriac, the Armenian, have generally been more comfortable with the cosmological complexity of the Enochic tradition than the Western Church, more willing to acknowledge the reality of the angelic world and its interactions with the human world, more willing to maintain the older understanding of Genesis 6 as describing the transgression of divine beings rather than simply the sinfulness of human ones. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, as already noted, has always maintained the canonical status of Enoch, and various strands of the Eastern mystical tradition, including certain streams of Kabbalistic thought within Judaism, have preserved and elaborated the Enochic cosmological vision in ways that the Western tradition has consistently tried to suppress or marginalize. The diversity of the ancient world's relationship to the Enochic tradition is itself evidence against the view that the tradition's exclusion was a matter of universal theological discernment. It was, rather, a regional decision, a Western decision, an Augustinian decision that became dominant through the political and cultural triumph of Western Christianity rather than through its theological superiority. The recovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 and the eventual publication of the Book of Giants fragments should have prompted a serious reassessment of Augustine's reinterpretation and of the theological decisions made in the proto-Orthodox tradition that led to the exclusion of the Enochic literature from the canon. In a world of genuinely free and genuinely rigorous theological inquiry, it would have done so. the discovery that the Enochic tradition was not a marginal curiosity, but a central and extensively preserved body of sacred literature. Literature preserved by a community of Jewish scholars at Qumran, alongside the texts that would become the Hebrew Bible, should have forced the institutional church to revisit its dismissal of that tradition. The discovery should have prompted the question, were the early decisions about the canon the right ones? Were the theological interests that motivated those decisions legitimate, or were they the product of institutional politics rather than genuine discernment? Were the beings described in the Book of Giants real, and if so, what does their reality imply about the nature of the world we inhabit and the history of the human species? These questions have not been asked at the institutional level with any seriousness. Individual scholars have asked them, individual theologians and historians and philosophers have wrestled with them, but the institutions, the churches, the academic establishments, the official arbiters of what is and is not legitimate knowledge, have not asked them because asking them would require acknowledging the possibility that the decisions made in the 4th and 5th centuries were wrong, that the tradition these institutions represent is built on a foundation that includes deliberate and consequential suppression of important truth. That is not an acknowledgement that institutions make easily or willingly. And so the Book of Giants continues to sit in academic journals and specialist monographs known to scholars and unknown to the public it most needs to reach, waiting for the moment when the question of its significance can no longer be deferred. The early Christian giant lore that did survive, that was not entirely suppressed by the proto-Orthodox tradition, is fascinating in its own right and in its implications. The tradition of spiritual warfare, of demonic possession and exorcism, of the ongoing cosmic struggle between divine and adversarial forces. All of this is preserved in the canonical New Testament and has always been a central feature of Christian theology and practice. The exorcism accounts in the Gospels are not peripheral to the message of Jesus. They are central to it. Jesus' authority over evil spirits is one of the primary markers of his divine authority in all 4 Gospels, and the casting out of demons is consistently presented as a concrete manifestation of the coming of the divine kingdom in the world. But the tradition that gives this exorcism practice its theological grounding, the tradition that explains who the evil spirits are, where they came from, why they exist in the world, is precisely the Enochic tradition that was excluded from the canon. The canonical tradition preserved the practice of exorcism while excluding the theological framework that makes it intelligible. The result is a tradition that insists on the reality of demonic possession without being able to explain what demons are or why they exist. The Book of Giants fills that gap. The demons of the New Testament are the spirits of the giants. The exorcisms of the Gospels are the continuation of the divine judgment against the Watcher's offspring. The kingdom of God announced by Jesus is the final resolution of the crisis that began with the descent of the Watchers to Mount Hermon. This is not a fringe theological claim. It is the theology of the Enochic tradition, the theology that was the assumed background of the earliest Christianity, and it is theology that cannot be fully understood without the Book of Giants. The refame of Ugarit and the giant kingdoms of the ancient Near East. In 1929, French archaeologists excavating at a site called Ras Shamra on the coast of what is now Syria uncovered the remains of an ancient city known as Ugarit, a city that had been one of the great cultural centers of the ancient Levant before its destruction around 1180 BCE. The discovery of Ugarit and its textual archive transformed our understanding of the ancient Near East because the texts found there, written in a previously unknown alphabetic cuneiform script that scholars quickly deciphered, revealed the religious and literary tradition of ancient Canaan in extraordinary detail. Before the discovery of Ugarit, the Canaanite religious tradition was known almost entirely through the polemical lens of the Hebrew prophets, who condemned it as idolatrous and immoral. After Ugarit, it could be studied on its own terms, from its own texts, with the same scholarly rigor applied to any other ancient literary tradition. And what those texts revealed was that the Canaanite tradition, the tradition of the people who inhabited the land that Israel conquered, preserved its own extensive and specific version of the giant tradition, a version that connects in remarkable ways to the Book of Giants and the broader Enochic literature. The most directly relevant Ugaritic texts for our investigation are those dealing with the Rephaim, a category of beings who appear in both the Ugaritic literature and in the Hebrew Bible, and whose nature has been the subject of intense scholarly debate. In the Hebrew Bible, the Rephaim appear in two distinct contexts. In the historical narratives, they are associated with the giant inhabitants of Canaan and Transjordan. Og of Bashan is described as the last of the Rephaim, and the pre-Israelite inhabitants of various Canaanite regions are identified as Rephaim or as related peoples. In the poetic and prophetic literature, the Rephaim appear in a different context. They are the shades of the dead, the inhabitants of the underworld, the ghostly remnants of the once living who have descended to Sheol, the realm of the dead. This double meaning of the word Rephaim, giants in the physical world, shades or spirits in the underworld, is not a coincidence. It reflects a coherent tradition. The beings who were the physical giants of the pre-flood and early post-flood world, after their deaths, became the shades of the underworld. They persisted in death as they had persisted in life, as a category of being distinct from ordinary human beings, distinct from the ordinary dead who also inhabited Sheol. The Ugaritic Rephaim texts are among the most extraordinary documents in the entire ancient Near Eastern literary tradition, and they are among the least known outside specialist academic circles. They describe the Rephaim as a specific group of divine or semi-divine warriors, royal figures, heroes, beings of enormous prestige, who are summoned from the underworld by King Daniel, a figure who also appears in the Book of Ezekiel as a paradigmatic righteous man alongside Noah and Job. The Rephaim are described as arriving in chariots, as great warriors and hunters, as beings of a divine nature that places them above ordinary human dead. They participate in a great feast that lasts for days. They receive offerings and honors appropriate to divine beings, and they interact with the living world in ways that suggest they have not entirely left it, that they maintain a presence in the earthly realm even from their location in the underworld. The Ugaritic Rephaim texts are important for several reasons. First, they confirm that the tradition of post-mortem persistence for the giant beings, the tradition preserved in the Enochic literature's account of the giant spirits becoming evil spirits after the flood, was not a unique Jewish theological invention. It was a shared, ancient, Near Eastern tradition that the Canaanite religion preserved in its own form. The great ones of the Old World did not simply die and become ordinary dead. They persisted as a specific category of post-mortem being, maintaining something of their former nature and power, accessible to the living through specific ritual practices. Second, the Ugaritic texts connect the Rephaim specifically to kingship. They are described as the ancestral kings of a specific dynasty, the royal dead of the house of the great warrior figures who ruled before the current order. This connection between the Rephaim and pre-flood or early post-flood kingship traditions connects the Ugaritic texts to the Sumerian king lists, with their impossibly long-reigning pre-flood monarchs, and to the biblical tradition's association of Og of Bashan, explicitly identified as the last of the Rephaim, with a specific territorial kingdom with specific boundaries and a specific historical moment of defeat. Third, and perhaps most importantly for our understanding of the biblical tradition, the Ugaritic Rephaim texts provide the background for the Hebrew Bible's use of the term Rephaim and help to explain the otherwise puzzling persistence of giant figures in the post-flood world. The Rephaim of the Ugaritic tradition are the royal dead of the ancient world, the great ones who lived and ruled in an earlier age and who continue to exist in the underworld. The Rephaim encountered by the Israelites in Canaan and Transjordan, Og of Bashan, the Anakim, the inhabitants of various regions described as Rephaim territory, are, in the logic of this tradition, not new giants created after the flood through a second incidence of divine human union. They are the surviving descendants of the original giant dynasty, the human or semi-human heirs of the pre-flood Nephilim, people who carry the genetic and cultural inheritance of the beings described in the Book of Giants. They are large, they are powerful, they are associated with specific territories that bear the names of the ancient ones, and their destruction by the invading Israelites is presented in the biblical narrative as a kind of second flood. a second divinely mandated elimination of the giant inheritance from the Promised Land. The geography of the Rephaim tradition in the ancient Levant is itself a remarkable subject of study. The territories specifically associated with Rephaim habitation in the Hebrew Bible, Bashan, Ammon, Moab, the region east of the Jordan, the Negev, Hebron in the Central Highlands, form a specific and coherent geographical pattern that aligns with what archaeologists have identified as the region of some of the most impressive megalithic monument building in the ancient Levant. The region of Bashan in particular, the territory ruled by Og, the last of the Rephaim, is covered with thousands of ancient dolmens, large stone structures consisting of massive upright stones capped by equally massive horizontal stones. Dolmens are found across the world in ancient contexts, and their construction requires the ability to move and position stones of enormous weight, a task that has traditionally been explained as the product of communal labor by ordinary human beings, but that the Book of Giants tradition would attribute to beings of exceptional physical power. The dolmen fields of Bashan, specifically the region around the Golan Heights and the ancient territory of Og's kingdom, are among the densest concentrations of megalithic monuments in the world. The tradition that this territory was ruled by the last of the giants, that this is where the giant dynasty made its final stand before being destroyed by the Israelites, and that this territory is marked by thousands of ancient megalithic structures. This convergence of tradition and physical evidence is not easily dismissed. The city of Hebron, in the southern highlands of Canaan, is another site of particular significance for the Rephaim tradition. Hebron is specifically identified in the Bible as the home of the Anakim, the giants encountered by the Israelite spies, and it is the city that Caleb is promised by Joshua as his inheritance, precisely because Caleb had been one of the 2 spies who did not fear the giants, who believed that the Israelites could conquer them with divine assistance. The biblical account of the conquest of Hebron by Caleb describes specifically the expulsion of 3 individuals named Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, who are identified as descendants of Enoch, that is, descendants of the giant lineage, the Anakim. Their names are preserved with a specificity that suggests historical rather than mythological memory, the same kind of specificity that characterizes the Book of Giants' preservation of the names of individual giant figures from the pre-flood world. The tradition is continuous, from the named giants of the pre-flood world in the Book of Giants, through the named Rephaim of the Ugaritic tradition, to the named Anakim of Hebron in the Book of Joshua. The memory is specific, consistent, and persistent in ways that demand historical, rather than purely mythological explanation. The connection between the Rephaim tradition and the broader ancient practice of ancestor veneration is itself significant. In the ancient Near East, the care and propitiation of the dead, especially the royal or heroic dead, was a central religious practice. The Marzia, a term that appears in both Ugaritic texts and in the Hebrew prophets, seems to refer to a specific type of ritual feast held in honor of the divine dead, a feast at which the Rephaim were invoked and expected to be present. This ritual practice, the invocation of the powerful dead of a previous age, the maintenance of a ritual relationship between the living community and the great ones of the ancestral world, is exactly what the Ugaritic Rephaim texts describe, and it is exactly what the Hebrew prophets consistently condemn as one of the most serious forms of idolatrous practice: the worship of or interaction with the Rephaim, the seeking of wisdom or power from the shades of the dead giants. The vehemence of the prophetic condemnation of this practice suggests that it was widespread and deeply embedded in the culture of the ancient Levant, that the memory of the giants and the tradition of interaction with their spiritual legacy was not a marginal or occasional occurrence, but a central feature of the religious life of the peoples whom the Israelite tradition defined itself against. Ugarit was destroyed around 1180 BCE at the moment of the Late Bronze Age collapse, the catastrophic civilizational breakdown that ended most of the major civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean simultaneously. The cause of the Late Bronze Age collapse remains one of the most debated questions in ancient history. the destruction of Mycenae and the Mycenaean Greek civilization, of the Hittite Empire, of Ugarit, of many of the major cities of Canaan, of the Egyptian New Kingdom's political dominance, all occurring within the space of a few decades around 1200 BCE. The standard explanation invokes a combination of factors: drought, famine, disruption of trade networks, invasion by the Sea Peoples, who appear in Egyptian records, but no single factor or combination of factors has been found fully satisfactory. What the late Bronze Age collapse definitively ended was the world of the ancient Near East, in which the Rephaim tradition was alive and active, the world in which the giant dynasties of the Old Order still maintained some presence in specific territories, the world in which the memory of the pre-flood age and its beings was preserved not just in texts, but in living ritual practices and cultural memory. After the late Bronze Age collapse, that world was gone. The Rephaim territories were conquered and repopulated. The Ugaritic texts were buried under the ruins of the destroyed city, to remain hidden until French archaeologists uncovered them nearly 3,000 years later. And the tradition of the great ones of the old world, the Nephilim, the giants, the Rephaim, retreated from the living world of ritual and cultural practice into the fragile realm of written texts to survive, barely, in the caves of Qumran and in the pages of the Manichaean tradition until the 20th century gave them back. The Rephaim texts of Ugarit, combined with the Book of Giants fragments and the broader Enochic literature, give us an extraordinary window into the religious and cultural world of the ancient Near East before the canonical traditions of Judaism and Christianity imposed their organizing frameworks on our understanding of it. This was a world in which the giant tradition was not marginal or mythological in the dismissive sense. It was a central feature of the religious landscape, the key to understanding the relationship between the current human world and the divine world from which it had emerged, the explanation for the specific geography of sacred sites and ancient territories, the background for the most fundamental questions of cosmic order and divine justice. The Book of Giants does not make sense in isolation. It makes sense as part of this larger world, the world of Ugarit and Qumran, of Bashan and Hebron, of the great dolmen fields and the ancient Marzia feasts, of the Rephaim invoked at the feast and the giant kings buried in the great stone chambers of the ancient Near East. This is the world that the canon eliminated. This is the world that the Book of Giants preserves. And this is the world that we are, slowly and imperfectly, and against considerable institutional resistance, beginning to recover. The living inheritance. What the Book of Giants means for us now. We have traveled a long distance. We have moved from the caves of Qumran to the divine council of the Enochic tradition, from the dreams of the giants to the politics of the biblical canon, from the megalithic structures of the ancient world to the genetics laboratories of the 21st century. We have followed the thread of the Book of Giants through 2,000 years of suppression and survival, from the clay jars of the desert to the academic journals where it lives a half-life of scholarly attention but public obscurity. And now we arrive at the question that gives all of this its urgency. What does it mean? Not in the abstract, historical sense, not simply, what did this mean to the people of the ancient world? But in the immediate, personal, present tense sense that demands an honest answer. What does the Book of Giants mean for us now, living in this world, trying to understand who we are and where we came from and what the nature of the reality we inhabit actually is? The first and most fundamental thing the Book of Giants means is this: the official story of human origins is incomplete. Not wrong in every particular, not a fabrication from beginning to end, but incomplete in ways that matter enormously. Incomplete in ways that have been deliberately maintained by institutions with interest to protect. The version of ancient history that has been handed down to us through the canonical biblical tradition, through the mainstream academic narrative of human cultural development, through the institutional management of archaeological discoveries and ancient textual scholarship, is a version that has been curated to exclude information that those institutions found threatening. The Book of Giants is one of the most important pieces of excluded information. Its recovery, its study, its integration into the broader conversation about human origins and ancient history is not simply an academic exercise. It is an act of historical justice, a reclamation of a truth that was buried, a reconnection with a past that was deliberately severed. The second thing the Book of Giants means is a challenge to the institutional management of sacred knowledge. Every major religious tradition has institutions that claim authority over what is spiritually true, what is theologically legitimate, what God has revealed, and what God has not revealed. Those claims of authority rest, in the final analysis, on the trustworthiness of the institutions making them. The story of the Dead Sea Scrolls, including the Book of Giants, is a story that should give every thoughtful person pause when considering those claims. The same institutional tradition that claims authority over what is spiritually true, demonstrably withheld for decades, documents of enormous spiritual and historical significance. The same tradition that claims to represent the authentic voice of God demonstrably made decisions about which ancient texts would reach the public and which would not, on the basis of institutional interest rather than spiritual discernment. The authority of religious institutions to determine what is and is not sacred knowledge is not self-evidently legitimate. It is a claim that must be evaluated in the light of how those institutions have actually exercised that authority, and the light shed by the Dead Sea Scrolls and by the history of the Book of Giants in particular is not flattering. The third thing the Book of Giants means is a reopening of questions about the nature of the non-human realm. The Enochic tradition describes a cosmos populated by beings of multiple kinds: divine beings, human beings, angelic beings, demonic beings, the hybrid offspring of divine and human unions, each playing specific roles in the drama of cosmic and human history. The modern secular worldview has declared this picture of a populated non-human realm to be the product of pre-scientific imagination, a kind of cosmological projection that fills the unknown with anthropomorphic inventions. But the universality of the tradition, its presence in remarkably consistent form in virtually every ancient culture on Earth, and the specificity of its content in texts like the Book of Giants suggest that what is being described is not imagination, but perception, a genuine encounter with something in the structure of reality that human beings across cultures and centuries have consistently experienced as a populated, non-human realm, as a world in which human beings are not the only intelligent agents, as a cosmos in which the forces that shape human history are not purely human in their origin. The recovery of the Book of Giants does not require us to accept the entire Enochic cosmological framework uncritically. It does not require us to believe that there were literally 200 watchers who descended literally to the literal summit of Mount Hermon and literally took human wives. What it requires is a willingness to take seriously the possibility that the tradition it preserves is responding to something real, that the beings it describes existed in some form, that the events it narrates occurred in some version, and that the implications of those events for the structure of the world we inhabit are not negligible. The Book of Giants is not a dogma to be accepted, it is evidence to be evaluated. And evaluating it honestly, without the reflexive dismissals of the academic establishment on one side, or the uncritical literalism of some religious traditions on the other, requires a kind of intellectual courage that the mainstream conversation has rarely been willing to demonstrate. The question of the giant bloodlines, of what genetic, cultural, or spiritual legacy the beings described in the Book of Giants may have left in the world we inhabit, is one of the most charged and most contested in the entire field of alternative ancient history research. The hypothesis that certain unusual characteristics in the modern human population, unusual size, unusual cognitive capacity, unusual longevity in certain ancient lineages, may represent the diluted legacy of the pre-flood hybrid bloodlines, is one that the mainstream scientific and academic community has not taken seriously, and that therefore has not been subjected to the kind of rigorous, systematic investigation that it deserves. The ancient DNA revolution has opened new possibilities for this kind of investigation. Ancient genome analysis has already revealed the presence of multiple unknown archaic human lineages in the modern human genome. and more discoveries are certain as the technology improves and the number of ancient genomes analyzed increases. Whether any of those discoveries will eventually converge on what the Book of Giants describes is impossible to predict. But the possibility cannot be excluded, and excluding it on the basis of institutional discomfort rather than genuine evidence is precisely the kind of decision that has kept the truth buried for 2,000 years. The tradition of the Book of Giants connects, as we have seen at length, to a universal human memory that is found in virtually every ancient culture on Earth. This universality is itself one of the most powerful arguments for taking the tradition seriously. Human beings are not, in general, inclined to invent elaborate and consistent traditions about beings who towered over them and terrorized them and ultimately required divine intervention to eliminate. Such traditions impose costs. They require sustained communal effort to preserve and transmit. They generate anxiety and require complex theological and ritual responses. They complicate the narrative of human uniqueness and human dignity in ways that are not obviously comfortable or convenient. The fact that these traditions exist in consistent form across cultures with no possibility of mutual influence is powerful evidence that they are responses to something real, that the memory they preserve is not invented but inherited from actual experience of beings whose existence was undeniable and whose impact on human history was catastrophic. The deepest significance of the Book of Giants may be its testimony to the reality of cosmic history. The idea that the universe has a history that is not merely the history of physical processes, but that includes the history of intelligent beings of different kinds, the history of relationships between different orders of reality, the history of transgressions and judgments and catastrophes that have shaped the world we inhabit in ways that are not visible in the ordinary physical record, but that are preserved in the traditions of every culture that has maintained the memory of its deepest past. This is a vision of the universe as morally and cosmologically complex, as a place where choices matter not just for individual lives, but for the structure of reality itself, where the decisions of specific beings at specific moments in history can have consequences that cascade through cosmic time, where the record of those decisions is preserved not just in the genetic material of surviving populations, but in the spiritual and cultural inheritance of the species. The people who hid the Book of Giants in the caves of Qumran knew that they were preserving something important. They did not know if it would survive. They could not know that 2,000 years would pass before it was recovered, or that when it was recovered, the institutions that had suppressed it would still be powerful enough to manage its reception in ways that limited its impact on the public understanding of ancient history. But they preserved it anyway. They sealed it in clay jars and hid it in the desert and trusted the future to receive it with wisdom. We are that future. We are the recipients of what they preserved. And the question before us, the question that the Book of Giants, recovered from its 2,000-year burial, forces us to confront, is whether we will receive it with the wisdom and the courage that the people of Qumran hoped for, or whether we will allow the same forces of institutional management and intellectual timidity that suppressed it in the first place to prevent it from having the impact on our understanding of the world that it deserves. The suppression of the Book of Giants was a specific historical event carried out by specific historical actors for specific historical reasons. The recovery of the Book of Giants is also a specific historical event, an event that carries its own historical significance, its own implications, its own demands on those who become aware of it. To know about the Book of Giants and to understand its significance is to be confronted with a choice. Accept the official version of ancient history with all its comfortable incompleteness, or engage seriously with the possibility that the world is more complex, more ancient, more populated, and more theologically charged than the official version allows. This is not a comfortable choice. The official version is comfortable. It is familiar. It has the weight of centuries of institutional authority behind it. The alternative, the world that the Book of Giants describes, the world in which the origins of human civilization are entangled with the choices of divine beings, in which the flood was not primarily about human sinfulness, but about the elimination of a specific cosmic threat, in which the spiritual ecology of the post-flood world is still shaped by the legacy of that ancient catastrophe, is not comfortable at all. But comfort is not the criterion. Truth is the criterion. And the Book of Giants, emerging from its 2,000-year sleep in the desert caves of Qumran, fragment by fragment, word by word, dream by dream, is making a claim to truth that cannot simply be set aside. The tradition it represents is too ancient, too universal, too specifically consistent across too many independent cultural sources to be dismissed as the product of imagination or wishful thinking. The physical evidence that aligns with its claims, the anomalous skeletal remains, the megalithic structures, the ancient genetic lineages that have not yet been fully characterized, is too extensive and too consistent to be explained away by conventional historical and scientific frameworks. And the institutions that have worked so hard to suppress this tradition, whose interests in suppression are so obvious and whose track record of doing so is so well documented, have forfeited the credibility needed to make their dismissals authoritative. The world has been told a story. The story is incomplete. The Book of Giants is one of the most important pieces of the missing part. And the time for sitting with that incompleteness, for accepting the managed version of our own history because the alternative is uncomfortable or inconvenient or institutionally threatening, has passed. The caves of Qumran gave us back what was buried. What we do with what was given back is a choice that belongs to each of us and to all of us as the inheritors of a history that is far stranger, far deeper, and far more consequential than we have been allowed to know. The people of Qumran sealed these jars and hid them in the desert and died without knowing whether their trust in the future was well placed. We are the answer to that trust. The Book of Giants is in our hands now. The question is what we will do with it, not what the institutions will do with it. The institutions have already shown us what they do with it. The question is what we will do with it, whether we will insist, against every pressure of habit and authority and institutional interest, on following the evidence wherever it leads, whether we will take seriously the possibility that the world is what the oldest traditions on earth say it is, rather than what the newest institutions say it is, whether we will honor the memory of the beings described in the Book of Giants, not by worshiping them, not by rehabilitating them as heroes, but by refusing to pretend that they did not exist, by acknowledging the reality of a pre-flood world whose legacy is still present in the world we inhabit, and by bringing the full power of human curiosity and human courage to the investigation of the truth that has been buried for too long. The Book of Giants was the last thing hidden, and it was hidden for a reason. It was hidden because it was the most dangerous thing, the most specific, the most detailed, the most historically grounded account of a world that the established tradition needed to eliminate from memory. It was found, as all truly important things eventually are, not because the forces of suppression weakened, but because the truth is stronger than suppression. And it is speaking now, in the broken words of 2,000-year-old Aramaic parchment, in the dreams of giants who are long dead and yet somehow still present in the world their existence shaped, in the universal memory of a catastrophe that remade the world, and in the traditions of every culture that has refused to entirely forget what that catastrophe destroyed. The Book of Giants is speaking. The question is whether we have the courage and the wisdom to listen. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.